are at a critical moment in your history as a city. You're on the cusp of seeing a lot of the change that was long envisioned and hoped for. And the question becomes now, as Halifax grows as a hub in Atlantic Canada, what does it look like as a city of the future?
It comes down to every single one of us to take action, to become part of the conversation, and to really think about what is the Halifax we want to be.
What is the human experience that will make our city great?
What kind of public life do you want in your city? For too long and in too many cities, cities have been designed this way, without people or public life in mind.
To create high quality public spaces has been very important, to create different qualities, different activities, contrasts and drama.
I can't emphasize enough the need for spaces where diverse opinions can be heard and respected.
Where people of all ages, socioeconomic classes, and walks of life can live.
You can live in this city and you don't need to own a car. You can live in this city and you can walk to work. It's about ensuring that we're not consigning another generation to a long commute, another generation to having a very large environmental footprint.
Fundamentals over flying cars. Don't provide technology for a problem that doesn't have to exist. If you solve it with good planning first and then layer technology on it's appropriate, it just works better.
It's really puzzling. It seems that architecture plays a very limited role in the, let's say, emergence or creation of those condo towers.
You know, it's kind of funny because in my previous life I used to be a lawyer, and I thought, man, I'm tired of everyone hating me. I'm going to become a condo developer.
As long as you're thinking about what it's actually like to live in the spaces that you're designing, I think then we can always know that we're moving towards a better design and a better place.
And so people are central always to our development.
There's a sense of optimism in Sweden about development, because it's seen as a way that we can start to create our city, create a city like we would like it to be created.
As opposed to seeing heritage as being on one side of the spectrum and growth and change and innovation as being on the other end of the spectrum, there's an opportunity in our cities to see those two things, the past and the future, as being fundamentally entwined and embodied in how we think about heritage in the city. It's not easy anywhere. You need a sustained conversation, a sustained debate, and that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. It's a good thing that hundreds and hundreds of people show up to public meetings and have a debate in public about what the city is becoming.
One thing I've learned after the years is that for living things, change is inevitable and not necessarily bad. I love the old city and I love the new one. I know it will continue to change, to grow.
We want to first thank Yute Lee for that great video that he helped us out with last year. I know a lot of you have shared that, so it really kind of captures what our first year is about. So welcome everyone to Art of City Building 2018. My name is Tara Wickwire, and I'm on the planning committee for this event, and I'm a senior director at National Public Relations, where my focus is on building stronger people, places, and spaces, and telling the great stories of Halifax. So I'm honored to be here opening our conference in the company of my amazing planning committee members, Jennifer Engle, CEO for Develop Nova Scotia, Paul Mackinnon, Executive Director of Downtown Halifax Business Commission, TJ Maguire, Urban Planner for Develop Nova Scotia, and Karash Rod, Principal at Rod Consulting. So we would first like to recognize that we are hosting this event on unceded traditional Mi'kmaq territory. The genesis of this event came from a big idea at a small table, getting people in a room together to talk about the future of Halifax and exchange best practices in city building and placemaking from around the globe. Our ultimate goal was to get different voices in a room to share ideas and inspire broader thinking. This year's event is themed Our Place, which is intended to inspire conversations around placemaking and our roles in shaping Halifax and understanding the value we have to offer in co-creating this place we care about. Artist City Building has become a reality from the energy of the community and many local supporters. These important partners have helped us keep this conference free and accessible and inclusive and offer a diversity of views from the audience. So our partners include Develop Nova Scotia, Downtown Halifax Business Commission, Marriott Halifax Harbourfront, Rod Consulting, Southwest Properties, National Public Relations, Halifax Partnership, Halifax Stanfield International Airport, Dalhousie Faculty of Architecture and Planning, Nova Scotia Department of Energy, Nova Scotia Department of Business, Killam Apartment REIT, Atlantic Developments, Garrison Brewery, Dexel, WM Ferris Group, Breakhouse, Cox and Palmer, FBM, Leyden Lynch, Turner Drake and Partners Limited, Halifax Public Libraries, MP Andy Fillmore's office, Grafton Connor Group, North End Business Association, Spring Garden Road Business Association, Quinpool Road Business Association, and Downtown Dartmouth. So thank you all. We go out and we make the ask, and it is certainly with your support that this is made possible. So thank you. We are so pleased to fill this room today with people who have an interest in the future of Halifax and being part of inspiring conversations about what we want to be as a city. Halifax is transforming and is quickly becoming the greatest mid-sized city in Canada. Since our inaugural event last year, some amazing things have happened. The Micmac Friendship Center is one step closer to building a beautiful and deserving new home. The Integrated Mobility Plan was adopted and will shift how we move in the city, including a network of protected bike lanes for all ages and abilities. The province has announced a Nova Scotia Accessibility Plan, and the Mayor has announced the Cogswell Interchange will be Rick Hansen Gold certified, both setting an example and benchmark for future development and physical. I don't know how to turn that on. It's all right. My voice carries. And accessibility in our city. Is the mic not on? Right. It's all right. Good. So we have hosted many large events at the new iconic Halifax Convention Centre. We have established ourselves as Canada's ocean leader as one of 5 Canadian superclusters. The number of residences in downtown Halifax has almost doubled. Volta, our startup incubator, now occupies 60,000 square feet and has launched 35 new companies. Just last week, we received a second international honor for the Argyle Streetscape, and business optimism in the urban areas has increased. And in the past 2 years, Nova Scotia has welcomed over 10,000 newcomers. You will have your own things to add to this list as it relates to momentum in Halifax. We encourage you to share those with the person sitting beside you today. We welcome you here and hope you enjoy the programming from our distinguished list of presenters. We plan to have ample time at the end of each session for conversations and your questions. Our planned breaks are minimal, so please grab a coffee at your leisure. We are live streaming the event today, so please help us share that and also follow along and engage on our social channels at Artist City Building 2018 on Instagram and Twitter. And without further delay, I'd like to invite Peter Wunsch, founding partner Breakhouse, to introduce our first presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara, and I'm glad the mic is working because I have a very low volume voice. So, let me start by saying that a little over 6 years ago, I was leading a project at my firm that was doing something in a small town in southwestern Ontario, a beautiful area just minutes from the edge of the mighty sprawl of the GTA. And this little town was feeling the pressure of the ballooning growth rate of North America's 4th largest city there. And year by year, the beautiful pastures seemed to be clawed away at, and as developers were hungry to insert their McMansion bedroom communities anywhere they could. So the village hired us, engaged us to help revision and energize the town square as part of an effort to strengthen community ties. One of the innovative community building concepts which arose during our research was the notion of using shared public space to plant edible gardens. And we'd found the most amazing example of this in a little town in West Yorkshire in the UK, where a dynamo of a woman named Pam Warhurst started a grassroots movement called Incredible Edible Todmorden. And it was an urban gardening project designed to bring people together through local food, building awareness about the environment, resilience, food security, all the while learning new skills, getting to know people in the community better, and as she would say in her awesome West Yorkshire accent, having a bit of fun. So we found this inspiring project in an equally inspiring book called The Compendium for a Civic Economy, a studied collection of organizations and businesses that demonstrated highly innovative and collaborative approaches towards creating a more open and shared economy. The publication, commissioned by the Design Council and Nesta in the UK, was created by 00 Architecture, led by Indy Johar. So I checked him out and was like, who is this architect who doesn't talk much about buildings, but kind of blows your mind when he talks about human behavior and how people should behave to make cities and communities better? So we discovered Indy's book through a Halifax connection, in fact, through my dear friend Joanne McRae, who's here today, who co-founder at the time of the Hub Halifax. Indy Johar was a co-founder and director of multiple hubs in the UK, so he and Joanne became co-conspirators in the world of shining the spotlight on social impact entrepreneurship. Anyway, when you look at Indy Johar and his project and his practice, 00 Architecture, you discover first and foremost ideas. There's plenty of fantastic architecture and design, of course, but fundamentally it's the ideas and strategy that seems to drive him. Ideas about democratizing design, sharing resources, ideas about how architects and planners should act, ideas about how all of us can contribute to placemaking in our cities and communities. Indy Johar is a very smart and thought-provoking guy, as you will find out momentarily. He's one of those strategic design thinkers who, when you hear him speak, makes you really believe that we would have a better world if there were more conversations had like the ones he leads. He has a very, very long list of accreditations and accolades, too many to name, but know that he has taught and lectured at various institutions from the University of Bath, the Technical University at Berlin, the Architectural Association, University College London, and Princeton, to name a few. Everyone, please welcome Indy Johar.
Good morning. I'm going to, actually, what I'm first going to do is switch on the mics. That's what I forgot to do. Right. Hopefully that will work. No? Well, the mic's on, but I think no one is home. Hello? What? I've got both. I have actually two mics. Anyway, yeah. We have mics. Good morning, Halifax. I'm honoured and delighted to be here. I think I can't live up to that stuff because that's not real. I'm going to talk about other stuff. I think we're in a really important moment, and I think, and probably you saw the news today in Brazil. We've elected a very interesting president, which follows on a trend that we're starting to see around the world. And I think when we start to talk about the city, I think we have to make a paradigm shift in the scale of the challenges that we have to talk about. And I want to talk about democratizing the city. And in terms of that conversation, I don't mean the vote. Too often we talk about democracy as the idea of the vote. I want to talk about democracy as the agency to create the city, right? So if you look back at the history of democracy making, it isn't the vote. The vote is the end pinnacle. What actually happens is you get democratization of banks for the poor, you get schools for the poor, you get universities, you get educational institutions, you get all of this stuff happens before the vote happens. And if we want to talk about the challenge of democracy, and I think we do have a challenge of democracy, is we have to really deeply understand the opportunities and the threats that our democracies place and the critical role of our cities. Cities are at the forefront of 21st century challenges. They are the knot where actually all these forces are coming together. And one of the challenges I want to put down for the art of city building is, are we really responding to the scales of challenge we face? And if we sort of pull on with that, oops, maybe we pull on with that. Maybe. Yeah. And keep going. Let's talk about this graph. These graphs are really important. If we look at the kind of growing issue of inequality around the world, what you start to see is we're seeing actually wealth concentrate in the hands of the few. We're starting to see actually the benefits of globalization. What you see on the right-hand side, or my left-hand side, what you'll see is what's called the Branko-Milanovic elephant curve. This elephant curve dictates where the benefits of globalization took place. And what you realize is the developed world middle classes, which are here, actually saw very little benefit from globalization. Wages have largely stagnated in many parts of the world for the middle classes, and what we're seeing is actually an issue of whether we call it Trump or Brexit or any of these realities. These are products of things that are going on in our world. And it's really important we bring them into the conversation of city making. And you can carry that forward with this. I found this stat deeply, deeply important. 4% of the world's wild mammals, 4% of the world's mammals are wild. 4%. 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 56 billion cattle in the world. 4% of the world. So, and it's about 30% of all the birds in the world are wild. 70% are poultry. So when we talk about the city, we need to see the city as a system which is massively infecting the world that we have around us. Right? And I'm now only beginning this story. Maybe. You perhaps have seen this. Watch this graphs. Watch these. What you start to see is anomalies in climate change and cities around the world. Every city, major city in the global north has gone 2 degrees on top. Everywhere in the world, pretty much. That's 2017, and 2018 was worse. So we keep going. We often, this is for the UK, but I suspect it's not that different from other parts of the world. Where's the benefits of wealth? Where are they being accrued? Well, they're all largely being accrued in land. For all our talk about, tech startups and all this other stuff, land is where the net wealth is being accrued. And it's not because land has become more valuable. The reason why it's being accrued is because our economy has gone from a tangible assets economy to an intangible assets economy. And in an intangible assets economy, those assets are intertwined, interwoven. And places and cities become more valuable in those realities. And land is where those values are captured. So if I was to, for a moment, ask many of you, who owns our houses? Who owns a house? Put your hands up. How many of your houses have gone up in value over the last 20 years? Right? So here's a little trick question, right? Has your house physically gone up in value? Most probably not. Right? You've probably done some decorations and moved through the house. The house physically is a depreciating asset. The land itself, probably not even agricultural grade land, so the land wasn't that valuable. Where did the value of that house come from? It's access to roads, transportation, parks, schools, all the social infrastructure that actually gives its value. So when your land has gone up in value, your house has gone up in value, what's likely gone up in value is public goods have gone up in value. Your house, here's the key word, gives you monopolistic access to those public goods. Now, why is that important? Because historically we saw private housing as the idea of my private wealth. But the reality is my house hasn't gone up in value. Public goods have gone up in value. I've captured those values. Now, this is important because if we start to see the city from this aggregative sense, so I'm not criticizing this, I think there's an opportunity to reframe value. There's an opportunity to start to rethink how we deal with the challenges of the 21st century. I'm going to stand closer here. And in this context, I think we also need to think about the scale of automation. So if you look at any of the theories that are out there on actually scales of automation, we're about to see one of the biggest transformations in our labor forces that we've seen. Go back to the 1800s to the 1840s, you had a 40-year, it's a period called the Engle's pause, where we saw the massive transformation in workforces, wages declined, and productivity went up. And I think we are starting to see the effects of this story already. I want to put down a hypothesis that Brexit and Trump weren't just phantoms of kind of just people's, they're also understandings of actually humans, the perception that humans are going to be a liability in the future economy, in a capital economy. A perception. So I would say the reason why we are all talking about increasing borders is because we think, well, actually humans are going to be a cost. Humans are a liability. So the reason why I say this is that I think we have to start to engage these conversations, not that I believe it, but I think we have to start to embrace the scale of transition that's coming, which is equivalent, in real terms, equivalent to an industrial revolution. And in the age of industrial revolution, we built new institutions, new infrastructures, new ways of seeing the world. It is no longer sufficient to tinker at the edges. And if we go forward, we spend most of our time hunting unicorns. So you see often the conversation is, who's got $1 billion startup? But let me put you back. The IPCC report gave us about 12 years to deal with climate change. On our watch. That is in our watch. So when we talk about the art of city building, we are talking about cities which are going to have to deal with climate change, deal with automation, deal with biodiversity losses of a scale and order that we've never seen before, and deal with a fundamental inequality of a network economics and platform economics which are concentrating wealth in the hands of the few. That is the future of the city that we need to be embracing and talking about. So that's kind of the opening, let's talk about this seriously. At the same time, what we have is politicians, UK politicians, you guys are better, I hope. UK politicians like Michael Gove who turned around and said, we're going to address climate change. Yeah, fine. And then what happens? And they say, well, we're going to ban plastic straws. Okay. Plastic straws count for 0.01% of plastic waste. And the reason is, and there's a reason that we cannot deal with the complexity of these conversations. And we pick obvious answers to deal with these problems. But that's not a problem of the politicians, that's a problem of us, of how we look for simple solutions, simple answers in a complex world. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face is, how do we deal with change? How do we deal with complexity? This diagram in front of you is all the drivers of obesity, just obesity. And what you see is there's multiple issues. Obesogenic environments, to foods and drinks, to policy infrastructure, whole sorts of interventions. And they're never going to be led by one party or one person or one organization. So if anyone turns around and says, hey, would you mind writing the obesity strategy? You know that's not real. Because there's 50, 60 different organizations and actors involved in that reality. How do you build a movement for change? There is our problem. And I've just spoken about obesity. Right? If you look at any of our big social challenges, they require us to innovate the way we drive change. It is no longer possible for a single managerial order mechanism because there's too many actors. And all of those actors need to innovate together. Yet it's always far more convenient to turn around and say, you know what, we're going to put a sugar tax on it. It's much easier because it's a simple solution, you know, magic bullet. But you don't have to deal with the structures of change that are required. And I think this is one of the kind of structural discussions we have. And you can talk about this, or you can talk about children, right? So if you want to look at children's outcomes, air pollution has significant impact on children's IQ. Air pollution, air particulates. Nutrition, globally, we're seeing food nutrition decline substantively around the world. And people are looking at cognitive stumping being of the order of 20 IQ points in the next 50 years. This is just food nutrition cycles. So when we start to talk about this stuff in the larger scale, and I've not even talked about, you know, prenatal nutrition, postnatal nutrition, breakfast clubs, all of this stuff that's required to drive this change, I've not even addressed that. So you want to shift the education of cities? It's not enough to just talk about schools. So how do we drive change in some of this stuff is, I think, a fundamental problem. And I suppose my role here is to be the provocateur and challenge the discourse of city building and challenge the reality that you have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity with extraordinary actors around the room to actually take a substantive leap forward. And the next 10 years is not going to be like the last 10 years. That I guarantee you. I'm going to come over. This is just a really good example to manifest that conversation I was having about food. That is our land use of America. What do you see, the big yellow thing? Where do you see urban housing? My point is these things are connected. You know, if you want to do something about climate change, I will probably talk about this later, simplest thing is go vegan. I'm telling you, this is where we're all headed. It's not even going to be much of a choice by the time this plays out. So when we start to look at some of this stuff, you start to look at the challenge of how do you drive innovation across 40, 50 different agencies at the same time? How do you drive change across multiple organizations? This is a map of public services in Hertfordshire. So looking at 40, 50 different public services that are given to elderly people in Hertfordshire, how do you drive change into these multiple actors is actually increasingly one of our problems. And you start to realize that the solutioneering is not about a single product. Too often we end up designing buildings, but actually the problem is as much procurement or as much about actually how we even understand. This was done about homelessness. In the UK, homelessness policy has nothing to do with homelessness. It's everything to do with how you allocate public housing. Right? That's what it's actually all to do with. And in order to be classified homeless, you have to be lying down on the floor. You cannot be sitting up. You have to be lying down on the floor when people go around with a counter. Right? So the policy infrastructure fundamentally changes and influences the realities we make. And I can talk about a lot of this stuff in detail later in one-to-ones. And also, food systems. We were asked to look at food systems in Dubai, and we did a whole mapping. What was the first question that came out? Everyone wanted quaint little sustainable food recycling at the end of restaurants. That's what they were looking for. You know, when you get to recycle the food at the restaurant, we were like, when you map the system, that's not the issue. The issue is substantial. Right? The issue is how Dubai actually goes vegan, if you look at the food story. So my first thing is, are we looking at the right scale of problems with the right scale of challenges that are on the table? And they're going to come on our watch. And they're going to come both with opportunity, but also with challenge. And the solutions for me are often diagonal. And as designers and placemakers, we often focus on objects, but I would argue that actually the issue is as much about how we design and create new models of regulation, which I'll talk about, as it is new business models and other methods of dealing with this stuff. And this is some of the work that we've been doing around urban systems drivers, and I can tell you the science behind this stuff is far more erudite. The science about linking air pollution to actually children's outcomes is significant. But actually, we haven't been able to build a political infrastructure and the political will behind it because we're not able to have the conversations. I don't blame the politicians. It's how do we have the civic conversation of recognizing the issues. I still have drivers telling me, I have a right to drive. And I say, do you have kids? Yes. Do you have the right to actually literally murder kids? Because about 800 children die a year as a result of asthma and pneumonia-related illnesses, certainly in places like the UK. And how do we short-circuit these cognitive realities? And we have to start to become recognizing we are both the solution and part of the problem. And it is a collective issue. It's a civic issue. It cannot be done by imagining ourselves as individuals. The next part of this conversation, I've got two parts, and this is part two, or three parts, and this is part two, is how do we imagine what it means to be human? And I think the reason why I say this is much of our discourse of being human is actually rather old-fashioned. And cities have always had a relationship of what it means to be human and the imagination of what it means to be human and the nature of the cities that were built. But actually, when you look at the science of being human, our conception of meritocracy, words like this that we've often become familiar with, I am here because of my success. No. You're not here because of your success. You're here because you had successful conditions, environments around you that supported you to be successful. Actually, my personal contribution to my success is minute. And it takes humility to say that and recognize that we are a product of our conditions. But also, it takes humility to recognize that this is a Dutch famine. We know in epigenetics terms, actually, the impacts of poverty pass 2 generations down the line. And if the impacts of poverty pass 2 generations down the line, what does justice mean? What is justice? What is equality? I think these are questions that we need to deeply ask ourselves. And we know that, in a way, if you put people in financial stress, they make different types of decisions. Right? We know financial insecurity deprives actually IQ points, and it happens to any one of us. If I put any one of us in significant stress, our ability to make complex decisions is eroded. And I would argue that our economic model, which has increased precariousness around the world, economic precariousness of people's lives, has actually destroyed our ability to think long and deep about the problems that we have. Right? That there's a reason why we're making a certain type of societal decisions. Oh, I wish this would work. And even the illusion of actually me as a human, the reality is less than 50% of you is biologically human. The rest is actually a huge bunch of other organisms that work with us. We are a multitude of organisms symbiotically working together. And even better than this, my thought patterns are not my own. They have actually cognitively, we replicate thought patterns of our friends and our associates. You know when your mum used to say, don't play with those friends, you will start thinking like them? Well, she was right. Right? So when we start to live in these realities, what does this mean? What is the idea of equality and justice in that world? And if you go back into some of the stuff about long-term emotional scars, in a high cognitive, high emotional economy, what does that mean in terms of unlocking the future of our collective realities? And then perhaps something like this. This is Dr. David R. Williams, and I think it's the most extraordinary piece of work, which looks at a Harvard professor who's been looking at the impacts of actually, he's been looking at the impacts of racial violence and racial aggression in America. And what he looked at was that people that were equally educated, right, were dying 10 years in advance of their peers, equally educated. Now, what he found was it was to do with microviolence. And the microviolence is everyday microbehaviors. And we've all experienced them, right? Those little things which actually somebody's constantly needling you, constantly trying, and what they did was they drive higher levels of cortisone in your bloodstream. Persistent levels of cortisone, which actually drive your high level of propensity for obesity, heart disease, and other chronic issues. So people are literally dying as a result of this stuff. So if I was to take you up on Captain TJ's enterprise, 100 years into the future, I guarantee you we will look back at this and think, shit, we knew the pathways, we knew what was happening, and we knew people were dying. And we know in poverty people die up to 20 years in advance of people that are well off. People are dying. And we now know the pathways of that stuff. So there's one thing saying there's a correlation. There's another thing saying, oh my God, we know how this stuff links. So the reason why I big this up is actually it's important for us to recognize the science of this stuff is well in advance of our ability to create policy and our ability to create new political justices. And the justice is not a gift. It's also about how we unlock and unleash everyone. So every one of you here is more extraordinary than any general artificial intelligence that's ever been made or is likely to be made for the next 40 years. Every human being is more powerful. Here's the deep question. Have we unlocked the full potential of every Halifax resident? If I told you you are more powerful than any general artificial intelligence ever being made, if IBM walked over and said, I'm going to give you Big Blue 95, you'd go, wow, great. And I'd walk over and give you a human, and go, it's more extraordinary. I don't think we have. I don't think we've even thought about the capacity to do that. Now go back in history. We built schools in Industrial Revolution because we recognized we could unlock the capacity of humans. How do we unlock the next generation of thinking around that? How do we deeply unlock the full capacity of being human in a way that we've never done before? We may think this is a kind of crazy-ass conversation, but how about this? In places like Vietnam and Taiwan and other places, this is the conversation going down. People are starting to think deeply about how we create the capacity for high cognitive, high emotionally intelligent societies, because that will be the new machine-human relationship. So this is not just a kind of quaint, nice reality. It's actually the new reality of a new hybrid. We already have a machine-human relationship. What will that look like in the 21st century? I think it's going to be really key. And these things. We are multitudes. We are strangers. Being alone is equivalent, and being loneliness is equivalent to having 15 cigarettes a day. 15 cigarettes. Our relationship epigenetically, in terms of our history and our context, is real. It's manifest. This is why I say we are entangled with each other. The idea of me as an individual is a lovely idea, but the reality is I'm entangled, both in space and in time, with all of you. And that, I think, is one of the profound transformations that we're starting to see, is how do we transcend the idea of the individual, which is just a conception. It was just a drawing, an idea of seeing the world. The idea of seeing the world through objects was actually a reality that we conceived in the 15th to 16th century. It is not total. There's a brilliant ethnographic piece of work that was done where they took paintings and showed them to a child born in a Western background and one child shown in the Eastern background. The child shown in the West would say, I see a vase. You ask them again, they describe the context. You show the same painting to a child born in the East, they would describe context. And then they would describe vase. So our social realities are constructed like the color blue. The color blue is a social reality. We gave it words and we recognize its reality. We have to construct and reconstruct our social realities. These aren't fixed terms. And I would say, more profoundly, for me, that we are they. We cannot define ourselves as individuals. We have to recognize ourselves in that reality. Just some stats that you might find useful. That's the scale of the transformation that we're talking about. 290 billion. How do we, in that future, reframe humans not as an overhead, but actually as a place of creativity and wealth? In order to do that, we're going to have to reimagine our institutions very foundationally. And also reimagine our bureaucracy. Reimagine it from, this is the conceptual model at the heart of most of our bureaucratic model, which is about the individual, profit, and the purpose, which is fine. I understand where this comes from. But the reality is, you can extend that thinking. I don't know how many of you know $1 Million Blocks, which is a brilliant project in Chicago. This is about actually looking at the social costs. So to go to, in the US, to go to prison costs $144,000 a year. $144,000 a year. To go to, I think it's Yale, is about $75,000. So when we start to think about some of this stuff, the reason why we don't think of it through that lens is because we don't look at future social costs. The state doesn't account for future liabilities and future costs. So it's an accounting challenge. So social impact bonds, which some of you will know about, are actually about bringing future social costs to allow them to be invested against. So how do we start to think about that in terms of our cities and genuinely allow us to build preventative intervention? We all know preventive intervention is possible and necessary, but the challenge is we don't have the state accounting infrastructures to deal with it or provide it. I'm sure this is the same pretty much most places. That's the relationship to healthcare, bad healthcare to housing, bad housing to healthcare. It's massive. Yet we think of housing as an individual unit, but the social costs are there. In that world, how do we start to think about smart policy? How do we start to think about smart rights? How do we start to think about some of the stuff that we're starting to imagine? And these things are coming. So whether it's looking at models of governance, which I hope Bianca will talk about as well, and other people, we are also seeing the reimagination of bureaucracy. So one of the big things I want to let down here is Uber. What did Uber destroy? Uber destroyed not the cab driver or the cabbie, destroyed the cab office, right? That's what it disintermediated. What it's reframed is actually our administration. We're about to see the biggest transformation of our cities to become post-managerial cities. As we saw post-industrial cities, we're about to see post-managerial cities. So the glass tower blocks that we've been used to building administrative quarters for, they're probably at the end of their cycle of value in the next 10 years, because those jobs are the ones that are being actually disintermediated. The question is, how do we reimagine governance and bureaucracy in that world? Right? This is a deep question, and most people are not investing in governance. And we're about to see a transformation of governance, whether it's smart contracts or whether it's actually any of the stuff around smart governance. So, New Zealand have done some really good work on looking at machine-readable law and machine-readable policy. What will that do to our new reality? How do the inbuilt biases that are being built into our institutional infrastructure, how do we start to deal with them? So it's important that when we look at cities, we also look at actually the transformation of governance that we're about to see. I could go on, but I won't. I think I'm well over my time. But also look at crazy stuff like reimagining property rights. Property rights as they currently are being unbundled. How we organize them, use rights, development rights, future resource rights. These can be separated and split apart in ways that we've not seen. Current property rights are being bundled together. This stuff, technology is enabling us to happen. And also allow for differential taxation on all this stuff. Real-time differential taxation on actually title deeds, property rights infrastructure. So there is a lot of shifting of bureaucracy that will transform how we see our cities, whether it's accounting or infrastructure, all the way through to building new ways of looking at property infrastructure linked to value. Because, as I was saying, your house's value is linked to actually infrastructure. Also opening up new ways to finance common goods. So this is a High Line project that we're doing in the UK, where we're looking at, so the New York High Line built massively private housing, the wealth about a quarter of a block in, massively went up in value. So public goods, common goods, created massive amounts of private wealth. How do you link the two together? So what we're doing is looking at smart covenants, linking private property, uplift of land value, back into funding the common infrastructure. So these sort of new business models are actually about business models for common good, which historically were too difficult to deliver because the cost of administration was too high. So I would put forward, actually there's a whole new class of public value business models that are going to be opened up in the 21st century as the cost of administration of system financing is going to be significantly lower. I think private value was the value of the 19th and 20th century. I think common value will be the value of the 21st century. And there'll be whole new value creation in that. How do we do that? There's lots of interesting things coming out around that. Preventative health. We all know preventive health is critical, but it requires massive transformation in our accounting rules, in how we govern, how we invest into places, many, many things. So if we want to drive this transformation of delivering real city transformation, we're going to have to build some of the institutional infrastructure for that. How do we go from contract formations, which are object-orientated, so changing an architect's contract to not be focused on the building and the capital spend, to actually be focused on the outcome. Imagine So I'm going to end pretty much here in the next 2 minutes, so TJ is probably not getting too nervous. So imagine as an architect you were asked to design a prison. Now, one model of designing a prison is to say, I'm going to design a number of cubicle spaces and it's all going to be safe and secure. Another way of looking at a prison is, how do I reduce reoffending rates? And the objective of the investment in prison is to reduce reoffending rates and offending rates. How would you design that solution? Radically differently. Because you wouldn't design it to incarcerate people, you design it for a different outcome. And increasingly we have the capability to look at that stuff differently. There's a brilliant ashram prison, which actually you go in, and including the wardens, they do a 30-day silence as you enter the prison. And the reoffending rates are less than 3%. It's actually a learning and rehabilitation environment. So we know the accounting of this stuff increasingly. We know the contracting of this stuff increasingly. I think this is the time where we have to give ourselves permission to build the institutions fit for the 21st century, which are there to unlock and unleash the value of every human around you, who is more extraordinary than any machine that has been given to us. And I think that is our failed obligation. The real deficit of every city is the deficit of actually not unlocking that full capacity. And that is a strategic opportunity that is on our table. So, in this story, I want to end here. If we want to talk about the future of cities, I think we have to talk about many of these things. We have to talk about how we drive inclusive growth, how we create the infrastructure for inclusive growth. We have to talk about how we build the human development institutions for the 21st century, reimagining our schools, our universities, our nurseries, our environments to actually unlock the full potential of every human. We have to build cities that are actually designed for preventative intervention in terms of health. That's just not about individually, but also as neighborhoods at every scale, as well as building all the regulatory infrastructures and the boring stuff. Because actually underpinning the reason why we don't do preventive health is because we don't have an accounting rules for it. So the great transition that we're in the middle of, and automation, I want you to keep that on top of your list. This is not about economic development doing whatever they're doing, and the city builders kind of doing nice sort of pop-up meanwhile uses. This is about a great transition of our cities. And it will be an integrated transition. And it will require a vision to step forward and drive a different discourse. And it won't be done by a politician leading by themselves. We have to be all part of the story and recognize this is a transition of all the environments we see around us. So with that, I'll thank you, but here's some important questions that I want to put up. And I think these are important philosophical questions that we need to have on our table. I won't talk through them, but I think in a world of interdependency, what is freedom? What is sovereignty? What is democracy in a post-privacy world? You could argue that we don't actually have privacy in the first place now. What does any of that work looks like? What is agency and freedom in a predictive economy? These are the big philosophical frames that are on our table. What is work beyond humans as labor? And the transformation requires us to move all the way up this chain, from democracy of actually expression, imagination, democracy of care, democracy to innovate, all the way through the chain. This won't be done in a small way. This is my favorite film from Interstellar. And I think this quote is really useful. Because I think the biggest risk we face is we imagine the future is a zero-sum game. And it's all about dividing the dirt that we have now. How much will you have? How much will I have? Whereas the future is infinite. And actually we have to reimagine and democratize and re-believe in the stars again. Because only then, I think, can we solve these problems. Let's look back up into the sky and dream of our place in the stars. Let's not fight for our place in the dirt. And I think that is about giving hope and democracy of imagination to actually our reality and what is a beautiful place called Halifax. With that, I thank you.
camera.
Is that all right?
What are we going to do?
You can grab all of them, yeah. Need both of them.
How was that? Is this on? It's good? Okay. Yeah, I just want to thank, so a couple months ago we were talking with Joanne and asked, who should we bring to the Artist City building if we decide to do that again? And she said, you need to bring Indy, Johar, but you'll never get him. So it just happened to send a note to Jayne on Twitter, said, would you by chance be able to come to Halifax for this conference we're hosting in a few weeks? And she said, I don't think I can, but if I can, I'll bring my friend Indy. So it's just, it's amazing how connected the world is. One quick word. So over 10 years ago, I was working as a planning technician in an office in Bedford, and my colleague and a good friend of mine, Kevin Brooks, he said, TJ, I'm going to this workshop tomorrow, you should come. And I was like, okay, so went with him. I didn't realize that it was a 2-day workshop and I only brought 1 day's worth of clothes. But that workshop was called How to Turn a Place Around with Project for Public Spaces, Kathy Madden and Cynthia Mackinnon. And it completely changed my entire thinking. And ever since that workshop, I've been focused on this idea of place and seeking that value from the community and that everybody has a value. And through that, I took another workshop in New York, and at the same time, Sophia Horwitz and Greg Woolner and Kate McLennan and Amy Schwartz and so many other champions locally were actually doing the work on the ground. And that led to them doing some work with McConnell Foundation and Jayne and a convening in Montreal, bringing placemakers from across Canada. And Ethan came to that, so did Mike Lydon, and so we had this day-long conversation, and at that moment they decided that they were going to have a placemaking week in Vancouver. And since then there's been a placemaking week in Amsterdam, New Zealand, there's going to be one in China, and so Halifax this community has added a lot of energy to this placemaking movement around the world, all chipping away and adding our own value. So I think that's quite incredible. And I don't know if you noticed, but I almost cried in the car when I picked you up because you gave me this book, which is the second edition of How to Turn a Place Around. And it's a pre-press copy. So I think with your approval, I want to donate this to the library so other people, maybe after I read it first, but. So about Ethan, to keep this quick. So Ethan has traveled to over 60 countries and 900 cities talking about placemaking for over 20 years. This is his jam. So we are incredibly excited to invite him to Halifax, and he said yes right away. And that was pretty much the energy that we needed to rally around making this event happen again. So thank you, Ethan, and come on up.
Wow, so this is so special to get to be part of. The group that TJ's brought together is amazing, but he brings this out in everyone, in all the different gatherings he's come to. He's been this sort of core community builder. He's reflected, I think, the strength in community building that you all are, represent and bring as well. So I think you all have supported him, support placemaking here and locally. And then, of course, we met his parents. He's one of these people you want to meet his parents. If you know there's some amazing people behind this that have a deep connection to place and are supported by this place, and in Peggy's Cove and Indian Harbor,
the magic of bringing us, many of us there and convening. And then the conversation, the alchemy of this group that he's brought together is incredible. So I want to offer this idea of place and placemaking and the lovely way of phrasing it of our place. How do we create our place as a means to hopefully bring together this amazing group of speakers, and how we're all coming at this from various angles. And then how you all are coming at place and placemaking from many different angles. The resources, the skills, the ideas are here as well. We've gotten to meet many of you yesterday in the wonderful tours of the city. But we think that when you focus on place, you do everything differently. Let's see. I was just gonna. Oops. Okay. When you focus on place, you do everything differently. And the big ideas that Indy brought to us, there's no one better to open this up and raise the level of conversation and the challenge, but also the systemic change that's necessary. And I want to offer place as a means to sort of turn upside down the way we're shaping the things, to connect us actually again with the dirt, with the very local human scale in our cities, but then to use that reenactment, that reinvention of governance, of the financing of cities, of the focus on the common value, the common, that shared value of the shared connection to place, how that can reinvent systems of governance and financing at larger scales. And there's great momentum in that direction as well. So we're seeing people coming from many different causes to this idea of place. And again, whether it's at the intersection, there's some wonderful institutions right around this library that can reinvent this as in many ways. Whoops. And then let's see how people come at place from so many different, so much love from each of these causes. But each of these causes, at citywide or a global scale, we're working with leaders to see how place can more fundamentally address their goals, draw on their solutions, but also take them out of their box and allow broader collaboration and more systemic change and innovation. Because alone we're not solving our biggest problems. We're not changing fast enough. So we need new systems. And the ones Indy's talked about are really exciting and powerful. Do I just need to stand closer? So you could take any one of these and show how focus on place is disrupting and reinventing them. But we think this focus on place, we don't realize the extent to which we're shaped by our places, and the which they are shaping our potential, as Indy says, the way we feel about ourselves, our comfort, our cortisol levels, our stress levels. There's actually great studies. We've done some with the Happy City. The Happy City's part of it's based here. Charles Montgomery and Hussam, and talk about how the comfort that you feel going into a public space is really key. But it affects your health. It affects your potential. We talk about it as a luxury, but comfort in our public realm is key, is fundamental to our potential as people and as civilization. But we don't realize how public spaces also shape, and create culture and preserve culture, but also disrupt it and evolve it. And it's culture that really changes, that makes the biggest changes at fastest in the world in many ways. And we don't focus on that, how coming together in place and debating how we shape our shared places creates culture and identity. Should I just... So we're shaping our cities in silos. We're shaping our cities with narrow outcomes, with narrow solutions. It's not that we don't need these solutions in these disciplines, but right now, if you plan for design and development, that's what we're getting. We limit the outcomes of these skills, of these solutions. I got to go to the Guggenheim Bilbao on my honeymoon 15 years ago. I was given a short amount of time to go there, and it was a beautiful building. It was a beautiful piece of sculpture. But as we got closer, the life of the city actually kind of died off. And I learned later that Frank Gehry said, "I do not do context." He also said that 99% of architecture is shit. And I've also learned that only 1% of the built environment is built by architects. So that's a problem. We need more architecture and architects shaping the built environment. But I think actually building not just for context, but with context and from context is actually the way to get there. And that this paradigm, this idea that cities have copied and architects have aspired to of just the icon alone is not enough. We're not asking enough from architects. This was the entrance to the building. It was hard to find the entrance. It's these stairs that make you feel smaller and smaller as you go down into it, sort of to worship the center of the building. This tourist couple was coming up the stairs and resting halfway up and looked exhausted. And so my wife and I didn't want to spend much time there. We wanted to see. We assumed that on the waterfront side of this building, it would be one of the more active, fun parts of the city. This is a central part of the city. The rest of the city's been quite wonderful and vibrant. But we went there, and this is all I saw. And I took this picture to illustrate a William H. White quote. William White was the mentor of Project for Public Spaces and my father, who founded PPS. I thought this image would quickly illustrate his quote that blank walls proclaim the power of the institution, the inconsequence of the individual for whom they are clearly meant to put down, if not intimidate. And moments after I took this picture, these two people mugged that tourist couple who had come up the stairs of their camera. And I'm from New York. Talk about cortisol levels. This is a place that creates high cortisol levels. So I'm from New York, and I had not seen a completed mugging before. I've seen mugging attempts. I've seen mugging attempts, but there were always other people around that prevented them. And I didn't do anything, but I told police, and they said people get mugged right at this spot all the time. This spot's designed for mugging. But as you go away from the building, people start connecting with each other again. People start feeling comfortable. There were people around the building taking pictures of it, but they were consuming it as an object. They weren't connecting deeper with each other or with that place necessarily. And they weren't that comfortable, actually. Which is, it's okay, but we have to ask more for. But we can have buildings like that sometimes. But we have to ask more from them, and they can be disruptive. And many people in Bilbao actually think that building's a distraction from what that city is about, what the soul of the city is about, its identity, its great, diversity and cosmopolitan culture. So Jayne Jacobs, of course, one of our mentors as well, said that to approach the city as if it were an architectural problem is to make the mistake of substituting art for life. We need to design not just for people in life, but from life as well. So, of course, we've been planning for cars and traffic, not life, and the transportation paradigm is the limiting factor for our cities and for our public realm. And this is the experience you have, in many downtowns throughout the world, and you don't come downtown again. You can't develop a connection. You can't feel like this is our place when you have, again, the cortisol levels, the stress levels of crossing a street. You're more likely to go out to a mall. But changing this is relatively easy. And you did this on Argyle Street first temporarily, and now with a wonderful design. But it's not about being against the car. It's about being for people and places, for a much bigger shift than just a design shift or a sort of a negative approach to traffic and cars. So we led a campaign with a lot of advocacy partners in New York City called the Streets Renaissance Campaign to create sort of a culture shift in the government and the way we participate in planning streets in New York. But the best part of it was actually the gathering of the advocates and the learning culture that was created through events like this in the city. That was where the capacity was built for all of us to better be able to shape our city together and making it fun. It was the relationships that we built through that process of actually, of being, really strong advocates about the problem of traffic. But we worked in about 10 or so demonstration projects around the city. This is when Mayor Bloomberg was still about more cars equals more growth, traffic equals economic growth. And the transportation commissioner at that time was, very, very pro-car and so forth. But we built a campaign to replace that transportation commissioner and bring in change. And Jeanette Sada-Khan got hired, and she hired many people from our office and the other advocates in the city. And one of the visions we had developed out of that campaign was to look at Broadway, and we worked with the Times Square Alliance and others to transform many of these key public spaces. But it was the advocates that asked for these first in the communities It's at the place scale, at the destination scale, that the capacity has been built for transformation, and that it's the processes that are so key. So we think cities can best transform themselves around destinations, and governance can be reinvented. And governance is often the limiting factor for the transformation of public spaces, actually, in New York and elsewhere. A lot of our first projects were, Rockefeller Center. We were given free office space in Rockefeller Center in 1975. We were set up by the Rockefeller family's foundations to put into practice the work of William White, and Jayne Jacobs was part of those offices as well. But the limiting factors we found were public space management efforts. So we've set up some of the first business improvement districts and downtown management organizations, and looked at really this human scale of not only design but really the programming management and the processes through which these spaces are created. So we think it's important not to just copy the design, which Indy's talking about, not just copying the High Line, but because we need to copy the processes, but read and do better on a lot of the management, especially the financing dimensions of these. The shared value that's created in each of these spaces is really what's transformed how New York is perceived locally and globally, but how they, but we haven't captured enough shared value, obviously, and the benefits aren't spreading enough to other parts of the city. But it's the stories of transformation. It's not cost-benefit analysis that would have led to any of these transformations. It's not a one discipline. Actually, the designers and different disciplines get credit for a lot of these projects, but the real transformations occurred at different phases, often from communities actually being somewhat negative, often from some controversy. With the High Line, it was preventing it from being knocked down. It was groups opposing development. It was more community-based efforts. But then how that negativity went into asking what we want, envisioning what kind of places we can actually have and want, and how that process built the capacity for community-based governance. And it's the governance groups that have really led and now continue to evolve, transform, fundraise for each of these places. The city allowed these things to happen and supported it at some key places, but it's really this community-based governance. Sometimes it's a business improvement district, sometimes it's a friends group. It's different models and different efforts. But each of these destinations works at the human scale, at the place scale. So Bryant Park, we did the master plan for it in 1980, but it works at this human scale. It's the managers and management of the space that's continually evolving and adapting the space so powerfully. But it's this triangulation. It's the things to do in a place that define it, and then we think you design to support that, to add layers to that. And it's that no one use or user group dominates these spaces, but that's where the magic happens. Jayne Jacobs talked about these sort of intricate minglings, and we think the intricate minglings have to happen at this scale for cities to work at larger scales. So we've done these trainings in cities all around the world where we bring together different departments, different sectors, to ask them how they can work together to create places. And we often do this sort of power of 10 analysis. What are your favorite places? What are your least favorite places? Places where you feel unsafe or a little stressed out or sort of not proud of that area. But then also, what are the opportunity places? The Melbourne, Australia city, a very livable city, was seen as, when they did this exercise, and we actually did this for Vancouver too in around 2003 or so, and they, in the same time, and both cities, so well known for great planning and urban design, but the planning director in Vancouver said, "Oh my God, we've planned the fun out of the city. We created green swaths and public space. We've done great urban design and development, smart growth, and but we haven't created the lovable places." And same with Melbourne. We hadn't created the places that people connect with more deeply, the informality. We've actually prevented some of that by leading with development that defines the public realm rather than the public realm first. So we think there's this evolution of development, of how we participate in shaping our cities, from project-driven, which is about doing it efficiently, creating the infrastructure, the basic goals. Discipline-led is getting good skills, getting the most creative experts to come in and give you the best design or solutions. Place-sensitive, sort of the best practice amongst the disciplines. Let's be sustainable, responsive to cultural heritage issues, get community input, come up with a solution that reflects that. We think we're not going to create enough change, and we can't create good enough places through that approach. Place-led is leading with the goal of creating great places, and then more importantly, building the capacity of communities and individuals to shape their places, to address their problems, and to create these new governance models, informal governance and formal, for shaping places, and through these places that innovation will occur in governance for a larger democratization of our cities and countries and so forth. So the private sector, the development sector, is an amazing partner in this. We actually find them the easiest to convince of placemaking, that if you lead with place, you drive value, you drive this common value that ensures success for the private sector. But of course, the private sector has been in a model of competing to take value. We have this taker culture where we're all, in most urban development around the world, and suburban certainly, is competing to suck tax revenue. You'll hear from Joe later about this. He speaks about it better than anybody. But we need to shift, we need to infect a new virus of showing how leading with place and common value drives private value, and that the developers doing that become the winners. So what is placemaking? So placemaking is a word we kind of helped make up about 20 years ago, and people are competing to define it. And an important part of the placemaking process is actually continually defining what it means and who does it and who's it for. And some definitions, it can be a collaborative process by which we can shape our public realm in order to maximize this common value, the shared value. There was a recent MIT study that found that, Susan Silberberg, that found that strengthening the connection between people and places, it's not just about improving the place, but the study found that the social capital built through the process of placemaking, through the debate, the conversation, that's most valuable. That capacity, again, that's built through the process of placemaking. So even if you know what the community needs, the process can yield much greater outcomes on many levels. So how do you do this? How do you create a city campaign in Halifax, and how do you connect that campaign globally for bigger change on many levels? So it's about making sure you're improving great places, focusing on tangible, doable things, and you're doing those things well. But then how do you connect those to broader capacity building and around governance around each of these destinations or citywide? And how are they taking on bigger systemic change issues? How are they addressing your economic issues, your social and environmental issues, and developing models that can support the conversation globally as well? Because there's a lot of innovation that's ripe to come from here. So Project for Public Spaces has gotten to work in so many different contexts around the world. We're lucky to get to learn from place and placemaking in these sectors, and we get to go in depth in a lot of projects. We loved working in depth on your Seaport market. Got to see it yesterday, and how that can become a gathering place for drawing out the place capacities in this city. But you need a range of public destinations here. And then, as I said, we're working to create systemic change. And how do you gather each of these different sectors? And we all come at it with different languages and different issues. Sometimes there's tensions between them, but how can place facilitate the best out of these locally and globally? But it ultimately comes down to individuals. It comes down to, we call them the zealous nuts, the people that are really passionate about changing the way things are being done, that don't define themselves by one discipline or in one role within government. And so TJ and many others, Greg and Sophia and that have been part of this movement in Canada. Jayne so generously convened and connected and amplified, is connecting to other movements and causes. In Canada, you have this placemaking network now, but you're part of a global one, and TJ was the glue behind. We gathered 48 countries in Amsterdam, and the folks that led this placemaking week in Amsterdam are here, and Hans and Charlotte did this incredibly beautiful, and have been leading the placemaking movement now in Europe with an incredible network there. And you'll hear from them soon. And I was just in New Zealand. They have so much in common. It was led by, we did different events with the business leaders, the elected officials, and the placemaking advocates. It was led by a Maori and indigenous woman. how connecting with the indigenous culture there isn't just about acknowledging the names and the connection to the land there, which is powerful, this connection to place, but the other ways of knowing, the more informal relational culture. Place and placemaking has so much to benefit from and learn from indigenous cultures that we're just beginning to start to understand. There's deeper ways that there has been an indigenous placemaking network in Canada that is we all need to support and learn from in much deeper ways as well. So these convenings are happening all over the world. TJ mentioned China in December with UN Habitat. We're launching a placemaking network in China to figure out how to prevent them from making a lot of the mistakes that we've been making in the US and elsewhere. But they're going to change and come up with new ways, new models for us as well. Each part of the world is leading placemaking from one sector, but actually how they're leading it, they're actually blocking other sectors as well. So we have to sort of really network this conversation very quickly to make it global. And the innovation, Project for Public Spaces is innovating, but all these placemaking leaders and organizations are innovating, and the learning has to happen a lot faster. And it's fun. We all love hanging out with each other. We love being together. And we'll come here anytime and eat lobster together with TJ's parents. But in placemaking, it's a made-up word, and it means slightly different things in different ways. Everyone's competing to define it, which is good. In the UK, it's more defined a little bit by development and design community. But there's a collective, there's a UK placemaking collective that's trying to reground that and define it differently. So we want that fighting, but it's being used pretty equally around the world on social media. And we've made it part of, we led a campaign with UN Habitat and the Swedish foundation, the Axel Johnson Foundation, called the Future of Places. TJ represented Halifax really well at these conferences. We had 100 countries represented to develop the key messages to include in the New Urban Agenda around public spaces and placemaking. The UN Habitat said, we're creating a global movement to shape spaces into places to give purpose and meaning to space. Fran Tonkus from LSE said that cities are not built forms, they are social forms. We must design from social life, not just for it. How does that really turn upside down the way we think about cities? And then Saskia Sassen was at this conference, and she said that the city has long been complex but incomplete, and in that mix of complexity and incompleteness lies the possibility of those without power to make a history, to make a culture, to make an economy. And I think of one of the great comparative advantages of Halifax is that you're incomplete, and that there's great discussion and there's diversity of typology, of places, of completeness along your waterfront, throughout your city. And there's this idea that people here that love it can help shape this, can debate this, and you can attract people from around Canada, around the world to come add to it. To help complete it and to help create the place, the culture, the governance, the identity, the economy. And so actually as a response to the New Urban Agenda, Saskia Sassen with her husband Richard Sennett and Dr. Close, who was the director then, and Ricky Burdett created these Keto papers that said that really what's key to making the New Urban Agenda work, to implementing it, is looking at cities as more incomplete, more porous, more complex. Many of the big cities are sclerotic, are complete. We can't change them, the culture of them as much. And it's the public spaces where this porosity, this openness, this welcomingness can happen. They need multiple uses, they need to be more flexible, and they need to be more informal. We need more informality. The type of the swimming, that occurred at your water's edge, how that prompted dancing that wasn't planned. Those in the images of that's where people connect to place, where they fall in love with place, where they feel like it's our place. The informality is where the lovability happens, where people connect deeper with the people they know with themselves, with other people of difference. Our culture, white culture has formalized cities in the process of cities. Male culture has done it. The city reflects this drastically. We need to feminize and informalize, make more indigenous the culture of how we shape cities and architecture itself. Detroit is another city that has been creating this sort of new model. And we've been lucky to get to work there for over 20 years. It's the city we've worked the most in a range of contexts, in downtown a lot, but also in the lower income neighborhoods. More recently, this is what it was, a vibrant city that reinvented the economy and culture of its time 100 years ago. It even had food trucks on the corner there. But at the turn of this century, this picture was taken in '99. Through every failed approach to urban development and economic development, we'd taken the life out of it. Everyone was competing to suck value from place, from culture, from the environment. And we did that vision with the business leaders. The city facilitated it, but didn't put any money into it. This is what it was like 100 years ago, in '99 or 2000. And then this project, Campus Martius, cost about $20 million to build and attracted a couple $1 billion of investment in the blocks right around it immediately. Corporations moved from the suburbs downtown to be part of it. And this is what it's like in the wintertime. Winter cities there's more demand to be around each other actually in winter, to find small places to gather. The markets, the fire pits, the blankets, that you can become a great winter city, of course. And then more recently, we've done this sort of lighter, quicker, cheaper plan with one of the companies that moved downtown, that was brought downtown by Campus Martius so still the private sector is leading, maybe too much. Each sector, our job is to work with whatever sector is leading, but then try to figure out what other sectors and what other groups of people are not included in the placemaking process and in the place itself, in the governance models and the ownership of it. The feeling that whose place is this is key, that it's, but this image that we developed was actually implemented within months. And the week that Detroit declared bankruptcy, we opened this beach at the center of the city. And this is what it's like sort of on a regular day in the summer, in the winter. And there's the beach. But it's at this scale that in a way, this has been a fulcrum around which Detroit has reinvented itself and how people have connected back with the city locally and globally. But during the Super Bowl, there was a lot of the images between the ads were of this space as sort of the soul of the city. So it's no longer about the skyline of the city, which kind of infrastructure, do you have a nice stadium or do you have a nice iconic building, but people want to see the faces, the culture, the places where people create and showcase their identity. And if you do it at the water's edge, which I'll get to, that's actually where it's most powerful. How your city reinvents itself and its economy is often at the water's edge. But the stuff is not that expensive, and you've done a lot of this so beautifully here on the waterfront. This sort of temporary, lighter, quicker, cheaper approaches to change the markets. This is the way to create informality, lower barriers to entry, to incubate the businesses, the maker culture. This maker culture that you have here is so key. But this is how cities have been built. They've been built through a project-driven, design-led approach. We might have really well-intentioned ideas, but we get public input after the idea has been developed, and the project can only become a little less bad. It's the idea is developed through one discipline, through one department. So it might be, and I don't know as much about the key projects, but this is the way it's done in a lot of cities. Whether if it's a transportation plan, even if it's a really progressive mobility plan, it doesn't look at it holistically enough. So we think we need to turn these projects inside out, start and upside down, and start with place and identify the stakeholders, the place assets, the economic assets, as broadly as possible, but around a distinct area. We have these tools, the Power of 10 and this place game, to evaluate a place and develop a vision of uses and activities, and not asking communities to design it or do the technical parts necessarily, but more the uses, the experience, the feelings they want to have there. And then to start doing things, build capacity through trials and experiments, and how it's that iterative approach. And hopefully you make some mistakes and get some bad press, and that creates a backlash, and then you get a backlash to the backlash, because that's when it really becomes some energy. So placemaking, this diagram was created by the Dutch Roads Ministry after we'd done a lot of training with them, and we didn't understand why they would want us to do anything, because the Dutch designed such great streets and public spaces. And they said traditional planning was you do the process, then you design it, then you hope it gets used. But placemaking is not planning, it's doing. And it is an ongoing evolution of engagement, of building capacity, of focusing on use, designing to support use. And you get to bigger, bolder things through this more iterative process. Waterfronts, though, are the best way to do this. I'm not going to go into this much, but we have the principles of how do you create great waterfronts on our website and lots of great case studies. But there's so much more potential for what waterfronts can be and how they can drive the culture, the economy, the innovation of a city. So but the debate, the process of defining your city at the water's edge, what your face to the world is the process of defining your whole city, but at these small key places. It doesn't become so abstract. These are these sort of these innovation hubs. But this presentation will be online as well. But Granville Island is one of our most favorite waterfronts, one of our most favorite public destinations, districts in the city. But it's at this human scale, the granular level of it. It's the food, the pie that I'm drawn back to every time. It's the maker culture that's so prevalent, the sort of the incubating of small businesses and ideas, and the food culture. There, they get the best buskers from all around the world. There in Quebec City. Where's the place where the best buskers in the world are going to come to in Halifax? We did a master plan for it was really a placemaking plan for Granville Island around their key destinations, around looking at their key uses. But it's the layering of all these uses where the magic happens, the intricate minglings, where the innovation can occur. And there's these key destinations that ultimately define a district too. And they still have the industrial feel. It's the commingling of these the cement factory with the university, which is unfortunately leaving, the market, the kids elements that really ground it in play and fun, with the artist makers so prevalent in the light industry, the boat building and so forth. All that connected and layered is what makes it so magical. It has rarely been created, or so much of waterfronts are defined by one single use alone. And they're all competing to define it. And just green space and parks is never enough for a waterfront. It has to be defined by these multi-use destinations. And how to do that is often, the limiting factor is often governance. For the limiting factor, as I mentioned, for public spaces is public space management, but it's also the silos of different departments. So place is a silo buster. I was just with this friend Neil McEnroy, who runs the Center for Local Economic Strategies in Manchester. We've been working in New Zealand. This is our third trip, working actually with a similar agency to develop Halifax that has led the placemaking weeks there. They started as Waterfront Auckland and did such a great job at place-led development, just as you had here, that they became the development agency for all of Auckland, and facilitating the placemaking movement nationally now. But Neil says that place eats institutional divisions for breakfast. Place is this disruptor, and it not only challenges the relationships between us all, but creates a more fun culture, a more collaborative culture, and reevaluates how we measure our success. In Adelaide, Australia, where I've worked a lot with the CEO, Peter Smith, who's now the CEO of Port Phillip in Melbourne, he came to New York, saw these temporary activations, and said, let's copy them, but let's make a much more systemic change. Let's do these temporary activations of public space to improve them. First top down, with the idea that anything could be removed within 24 hours. But he saw placemaking as a way to reinvent city. He says that placemaking is the single most important strategy that governments can adopt to build community and citizen capacity over time. And so this small activation program became a means to sort of infect and reinvent their city governance, to change how they evaluate their success using these place criteria, to actually eventually to devolve government to the districts, the precinct scale a little bit. First, government gets more holistic and collaborative, but and so forth. So we're seeing this now lead to a new paradigm. We've been working with Brookings for a few years now, looking at how they were finding innovation districts weren't that innovative or inclusive necessarily, and seeing how place can help reinvent innovation districts, which is this trend and this idea going globally. But this nexus between economy shaping and place shaping, placemaking is this realm that's creating these new models of governance that I think Indy has started to allude to. Hopefully we can discuss more. It's not just talent attraction, but capacity building, talent evolution, potential building from the people that are already there. They create this experimenting, this faster rate of learning, the collisionable activities. It's the fun, the serendipity that increases within cities when people work in this way. That's what happens. It's the social density. The best places in this world, you can have social density on a rural main street. We don't see a huge correlation between density and social density. So it's a good public realm acts like social density, and we think this is what drives innovation, but also inclusion. And then you'll hear from Matthew later. He's researching how can the types of innovation, how can we get better innovation that actually reflects and supports a more human-centered world, the capacity of humans, not computers, to create change. How do we get better change, better innovation from place-led, place-grounded innovation hubs? So these innovation hubs have to bring together innovation assets, place assets with networking assets in one destination. It's this intricate minglings again. This is where it works. And so it's a few places within Halifax that are going to create the magic, that create the new ideas. They're going to reinvent how you're seen locally, going to develop the lovability, the place attachment, not just the livability. You're not going to compete with other cities or achieve livability with the livability that other cities have through focusing on livability alone, the infrastructure, the copying of the better design. It's through this informality, this intermingling, this lovability that you're going to achieve livability more affordably, inclusively, and quickly. And that placemaking it's a language and a framework to tie this together to make it more accessible, more common sense, and to democratize the shaping of cities, the shaping of reinventing of governance, as Indy said. So I'm really excited to get to be part of this whole conversation. This is the start of something we're going to be involved throughout our lives, all of us, to connect with this and learn from you all as you go through this and become a model globally. You are a model globally, but you have a lot of responsibility, both to your community, to your place, but to how the learnings here can infect the Canadian placemaking movement and the global one as well. So we're in it with you for the long run. Looking forward to the continued conversation. Thank you.
A chance to stretch your legs if you want to grab a coffee, but we'll try to stay on time. So just 2 minutes and then we'll reconvene. Thanks.
Quick questions.
Welcome back. I'd love to introduce you to our next speaker, who is a most remarkable person, who's been an inspiration and a mentor, as well as a collaborator and a friend. Jayne Engle is a leading thinker and doer in Canada, working tirelessly to democratize our cities. With 25 years of experience in participatory city planning, urban revitalization, and economic development, both in North America and Europe, her work ranges from a Peace Corps tour of duty in Central Europe post-fall of the Berlin Wall, to planning work in marginalized neighborhoods in U.S. cities, to her current role as the curator for Cities for People with the McConnell Foundation in Canada. To me, though, the extraordinary thing about Jayne is in the midst of working nationally and internationally with large-scale initiatives, she manages to prioritize people at the core of the work. She meets with them, connects, and supports the best potential in everyone she works with, myself included. An example of how she practices what she preaches, Jayne hosts a live music series I've been wanting to go to for years in the back balcony of her home in Montreal every summer. She's an inspiration, and I'm thrilled we have this opportunity to amplify her voice here among city builders in Halifax. Thank you very much, and welcome, Jayne.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me here okay? It's a little bit distant, but if we can move it so that I don't have to. Can you hear me okay like that? Is that good? Okay. Sophia, thank you for that very warm introduction. Really appreciate it and hope I can live up to it. It is an absolute thrill and an honor to be here in Halifax with you all. Thank you so much for this invitation. And it's also an honor to follow my esteemed colleagues and friends, Ethan and Indy, who I've had the opportunity to work with, and am thrilled to be able to build on some of their ideas. So I'd like to change the energy for just a moment and take the first few minutes, given that this is an Art of City Building conference, to introduce a new art form called songlines. I won't sing, don't worry. But really, the intention behind what I want to speak with you about today is how can we raise expectations of what our cities can be? How can we raise our expectations about what Halifax can be? So that's really informing my thinking a lot these days, and it's also informing what I want to discuss with you this morning. So the songline that I want to share with you. So songlines are actually, they're in Australian Aboriginal culture. They are both metaphoric and physical creation storylines that run across the landscape and provide a way of understanding the stories over time of geographical and of sacred sites. And Leonie Sandercock, the great postmodernist city planner and filmmaker and a mentor of mine, wrote in one of her books, Cosmopolis 2, she wrote this city songline. And by the way, I'm also going to gift a book to the library because I would like to be reading from the physical book, but this library doesn't have it, so I'm going to gift it. So just before I read this, and it will take a few minutes, what I'd like you to imagine is that we have a fire, a nice fire in the center here. Take a couple of deep breaths, and if you like, even close your eyes while I read this city songline, and try to imagine not only where Leonie would have been writing this from Los Angeles, probably 15 years ago or so now, but also perhaps to imagine what you dream of for your city. Here goes. I look into my crystal globe, and I dream of the carnival of the multicultural city. I don't want a city where everything stays the same and everyone is afraid of change. I don't want a city where young African Americans have to sell drugs to make a living, or Thai women are imprisoned in sweatshops in the garment district where they work 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. I don't want a city where I'm afraid to go out alone at night or to visit certain neighborhoods even in broad daylight, where pedestrians are immediately suspect and the homeless always harassed. I don't want a city where the elderly are irrelevant and youth is a problem to be solved by more control. I dream of a city of bread and festivals where those who don't have the bread aren't excluded from the carnival. I dream of a city in which action grows out of knowledge and understanding, where you haven't got it made until you can help others to get where you are and beyond, where social justice is more prized than a balanced budget, and where I have the right to my surroundings, as do all my fellow citizens, where we don't exist for the city, but are seduced by it, where scarcity doesn't build a barbed wire fence around carefully guarded inequalities, and where no one flaunts their authority and no one is without authority. I want a city where people can cartwheel across pedestrian crossings without being arrested for playfulness, where everyone can paint the sidewalks and address passersby without fear of being shot, where there are places of stimulus and places of meditation, where there's music in public squares and street performers don't have to have a portfolio and a permit, and street vendors coexist with shopkeepers. I want a city where people take pleasure in shaping and caring for their environment and are encouraged to do so, where neighbors plant bok choy and taro and broad beans in community gardens. I want a city that is run differently from an accounting firm, where planners plan by negotiating desires and fears, mediating memories and hopes, and facilitating change and transformation. So Leonie calls that her love song for the city. And it's really about naming existing narratives and expressing desired ones. And it's really about reconciling dreams and aspirations with expectations. So yes, we have to dream and we have to imagine much bigger, but we also have to expect much more. We have to get more rigorous. We have to work together differently, which I'll talk about a little bit later, in order to achieve these grand aspirations. So I want to talk about one way of looking at change, one way of looking at how we can achieve the kind of transformation that we need. And this is just one way of looking at change that we do in our Cities for People work. And that is based on a hypothesis that possibilities for positive transformation open up to cities that think and act in these ways. And the first bubble is about learning to collectively listen and make sense collectively so that we can have much more effective collective action. We're always focused on collective action, but the argument is that that would actually be much more effective if we learned how to listen much better to each other. The second bubble in the lower right is about identifying and really valuing in our practices and policies over and over, deliberately and relentlessly, what are the core values, what is it that we share. It might be around reconciliation, innovation, resilience, inclusion, etc. And then third is making possibilities visible. So back to what Ethan was just presenting. Making all of this visible in space, in tangible space, experimenting with regulatory changes, experimenting with work on the ground, with making and sharing spaces through networks, really writing new narratives about what cities can be. So I just want to say a few words about the McConnell Foundation where I work. So the McConnell Foundation, for those who don't know it, it's a private family foundation. We have a pan-Canadian mandate. We're based in Montreal but work across the country. And we are really about creating a culture of social innovation and building a more inclusive and resilient society in very engaging ways with civil society, with all sectors, and with the public. And our work is quite focused right now on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, very much aligned with that, and really gearing ourselves up and working with a range of multi-sectoral partners on what Indy was talking about with respect to the great transition that is ahead of us. So our initiatives are primarily around Indigenous reconciliation, around social innovation, social entrepreneurship in universities, as well as youth and childhood mental health, food systems, energy and economy, and cities. And our main two cities initiatives are Cities for People and Future Cities Canada. So one of the things that we've been quite focused on, especially recently, is something that the federal government created a co-creation steering group last year, and our CEO, Stephen Huttard, was a member of this, and they recently put out the Social Innovation and Social Finance Strategy. And I invite you to have a look at this, because there's a way for all of us to engage in this. This is, again, it's about creating a culture of social innovation, but also creating the mechanism, the social finance funds, the networks in cities across the country to continue growing our social finance ecosystems so that we can build what we need to for this great transition ahead. So a couple of the strategy questions we're asking ourselves is, how can we create better equality in cities? And also that we need to go beyond sustainability. How can we move beyond it to be regenerative in the way that we develop our cities for the long term? So I just want to give a few examples of our work and also some of the things that we're inspired by. So an example is We Are Cities. And We Are Cities was a listening process. I talked about collective listening, collective sense-making. This was something we supported a few years ago now, which was a civic engagement process across the country. It was led by our partner Evergreen, based in Toronto, but we had conveners throughout the country, including here in Halifax. The Ecology Action Centre led a series of roundtables that many of you hopefully were involved in. And so what we heard through this process was that after talking with thousands of people across the country about what they expected from their cities, there were really 5 key themes that came out of it. And those are in the lower left, which were around equality, concerns about equality in all its forms, the commons, seeing the city as a commons, data, concerns about data, which we'll talk about in a couple talks a little bit later. Obviously a growing concern for all sorts of reasons in our world right now. Urban indigenous issues and opportunities, as well as future-proofing. So what does community resilience, what does disaster resilience need to look like as we plan for our cities over the next, over the coming decades and even centuries for that matter? So TJ already said something about Canadian placemaking, but I just want to add to that the Canadian placemaking work over here came out of really our thinking around this city as a commons. And we ended up connecting with Ethan and Project for Public Spaces, but that movement was actually led by groups here in Halifax, and I'm sure that some of you were involved with that. Sophia, who introduced me, had an idea that there are all kinds of fantastic innovations around the country, but they're not well connected, they're not having enough impact, and they might not even be identifying themselves as placemakers or connected to a broader movement. And we can actually have much greater impact if we work together. And so she and others, she and her partner Greg, undertook a study. We had a placemaking lab, and it's grown, and it's built on itself, and now we have a whole kind of self-organizing group across the country. This is how these movements of change really need to be built, from organic grassroots efforts. So I want to turn now to a little bit of our thinking and work around civic assets, what we call civic assets in the civic commons. So by civic assets, we're talking about places like this. So libraries, schools, churches, public spaces, parks. And they're the assets in our communities which have been strategically located and very important in the past, but in many cases, are either underused or disused and could provide much better community serving needs. So in many cases, these are just huge latent value in these assets that we're not realizing. At the same time, we have so many needs that also aren't being met. So there needs to be a much better match and much more strategic thinking in how we address those. So the civic commons is really where we do together what we can't do alone. So this is the backbone of the city. And Ethan in his last talk referred to Saskia Sassen. You know, in one of her recent talks, her provocation was, who owns the city? And it's funny because that's such an obvious question in a way, but it's something that we don't often think of or ask ourselves. And if the answer to it is actually that we all do, then that has huge implications, actually, for how we think about the city. Indy talked about land value and other kinds of value, and rethinking fundamentally how we place value on land, on intangibles, also on data assets as they're growing. So as we think about who owns the city and how we can see the city as a commons for collective resource sharing is a huge question for our future. So Sheila Foster is one of the great prolific writers on this right now. She and also Christian Ioni, who are also the founders of GovLab. And seeing the city as a commons is about seeing the city as a collaborative shared space. And it's really about engaging people also in the managing of resources, in the ownership of resources, not just buildings and neighborhoods, but also infrastructure and digital assets. So that requires a fundamental rethink of how we view the city and how we think about how we organize ourselves for change. This is an example of, in Montreal, a church where we supported a small equity investment. It's being now reused. It's the impact hub for Montreal. It's a co-working space. It's also an event space. Obviously, there are hundreds and hundreds of churches across the country which are in similar need of addressing and similar opportunities for. So I want to provide one example from Montreal. This is called a transitory laboratory, and it's one of the most successful prototypes that we've actually had the opportunity to be a part of. So it's a partnership of our foundation, Mackinnon, with the City of Montreal, and with two social enterprises, Entremise and La Maison de l'Innovation Sociale, the Social Innovation House in Montreal. And it's really about connecting people without spaces to spaces without people. So we worked with the city. The city has actually put into its Heritage Action Plan a policy that it will provide municipally owned vacant buildings for community serving needs. Seems like a simple idea, but as many of you will know, especially if you work in city government, it's really difficult, and that raises all kinds of questions, all kinds of regulatory barriers around that, and so on. But we managed to do it. We opened the first transitory laboratory hub, which is also the Future Cities hub for Montreal, here back in the spring, and it's hosting about 25 micro-social entrepreneurs. We also filled a market niche where there wasn't enough collaborative co-working space, particularly at very low cost, for micro makers as well as micro-social entrepreneurs, artists, and others. And our mayor, Valérie Plante, is in the center launching it back in March. So just to give you a short context of future cities, so the bubble at the bottom is what we envision right now with this new initiative, Future Cities Canada. So far there are two hubs. There's a hub in Montreal, and there's a hub which will open next week in Toronto at the Future Cities Summit at the Evergreen Brickworks being held there next week. The Future City Center there will be launched. That's actually the background photo is the Brickworks. And we imagine, though, collaborating with a number of hubs, existing and potentially new hubs across the country. So stay tuned for more on that. And Future Cities was really designed to provide, in some ways, what both Ethan and Indy were referring to, that how we organize ourselves, how we govern ourselves, we have to actually really raise our game in order to rise to the challenges that we're facing. And so we designed Future Cities as a collaborative infrastructure to try to address our challenges differently at a different scale. And the four areas of innovation that we're focused on to start with are the ones at the top: participation, governance, infrastructure, and capital innovation. So I want to share just two examples of initiatives or movements, what are becoming movements around the world that inspire me and that I feel like we have a huge opportunity to build on, to adapt for context here and to build on. This one is Fab City, and Fab City grew out of Barcelona, but there are actually now 28 cities in the network, and Fab City is really based on the idea that, and the aspiration and expectation that in 35 years, cities should learn to, should become making cities and actually produce all that they consume. So, and actually the International Fab City Conference, by the way, is coming to Canada. It will be in Montreal in 2020. There are no Canadian cities yet signed up to this movement, so maybe Halifax could be the first. And then the other one is Participatory City. And Participatory City is in London. And I'm going to start a video in just a minute. I'm going to show you a couple of minutes of a video to describe what it is. What I find super compelling about it is that so many of us, so much of what Ethan described, what Sophia does, what you do here in Halifax, is actually this, but this is packaged, shared in a way that builds new narratives of possibility, but also it's done in a massive collaborative way at the neighborhood scale that has huge opportunity for systems change and for scaling, not just across a city, but actually in other cities. So it's really about a movement. So let's have a look at this video for a couple minutes to get a flare. You can find the full video if you want to see more, and lots of publications, lots of the research behind it. In fact, a book just came out this week, a report of the first year of this in a borough in London. Was just came out Friday, and I should mention the founder of Participatory City. Her name is Tessie Britton. She'll be in Canada for 2 weeks, next week and the week after. So she'll be for 1 week with us in Toronto at the Future City Summit, and then the following week she'll be with us in Montreal. I'd love to get her to Halifax sometime if there's interest. But in the meantime, if any of you are able to come to Montreal or Toronto in the next couple weeks, you are most welcome. So for me, part of, as I said, part of the innovation is around scaling this, but it's also the organization of it. This is an example of how already there are groups in Montreal. This is a participatory city, so one of our outstanding, what I consider to be a world-class placemaking group in Montreal called La Pépinière is organizing participatory city in Montreal and trying to structure it around, this is again one of the ideas that's inspiring me, the idea of creating free zones in neighborhoods around the city. And the idea of these free zones is that people would have an opportunity to prototype experiments that might be outside the usual rules of city government, so they might be outside regulatory guidelines, but at the same time there could be an opportunity for excellent data collection, for monitoring, data collection in all kinds of ways, quantitative, qualitative, and so on, in order to gauge what difference these experiments are making and then what is ripe for actual regulatory change or scaling in other places. Oops. Okay, so this is, don't worry about the little bits, but the point of this is that in in innovating how we organize ourselves, we're finding increasingly that the way our organizations and the way our institutions are structured are actually stifling. So even though there are so many great innovators and entrepreneurs within organizations and institutions, it's very hard, as so many of you will know, to make change. And so we're finding that working in ecosystems with supporting platforms can actually be a much more effective way to reach the kind of change we need. And I want to say something about ecosystem working and what we're finding. And that is that operating, Indy was talking about 3 or 4 levels of change or horizons of change in terms of governance. What we're finding is that within ecosystems, it's absolutely essential. I don't want to be discouraging to people that we only have to be thinking, 100 years ahead, because I know for some people that takes away a sense of agency. So we need projects and programs which are demonstrating what is possible, but we actually need that, and that's Horizon 1. But we actually need so much more than that. We need to be testing, we need to be pushing up against our rules, and we need to be imagining what's possible way ahead in the future and how we need to change our systems and structures in order to get there. So within ecosystems of change, all 3 of those horizons need to be recognized. So I just have a couple more minutes, and in the last few minutes, I want to introduce an idea which I think can really help us to address so many of the challenges that we're facing and really help us to rise to the scale of the challenge by thinking differently and then hopefully acting together differently. And the idea is around 7-generation thinking and 7-generation cities. As most of you will know, in Aboriginal culture, when any time that something is planned for or thought about in any sort of process, you wouldn't begin to consider until you thought about what happened 7 generations ago and then what was possible for 7 generations into the future. So it's just a way of thinking. It's unthinkable to do otherwise. Well, from a global perspective, if we think about 7 generations ago, the world population was right around 1 billion people. Okay, hugely different, right? We're more than 7 times what we were. It was also an 85% rural population in the world. In this country, it's now the reverse of that. We're about 85% urban. So the world has changed drastically. So if we just those 2 facts, if we think about that 7 generations ago and then project ahead, it's not enough actually just to think about 21st century cities. We should be thinking about 22nd century cities, particularly for Halifax right now. You have huge decisions to make, right? You have the port development, you have other developments which are happening downtown. You have so much that's going on that will have an impact on the city well beyond the time that any of us or our children or our children's children are alive. And so what we decide now is hugely important. Just before I close, I want to play one more video, and this is from the Indigenous Placemaking Council. It's just 1.5 minutes, but just to get us in the frame of thinking of how Indigenous culture can better infuse our thinking.
What does belonging look like? If nothing of your culture, history, language, or art is visible in the streets, parks, buildings where you live, how can you ever feel welcome there? The Indigenous Placemaking Council seeks to restore Indigenous presence in Canadian cities, towns, and communities.
So what city should we expect and aspire to? What would our city look like if we infused Indigenous thinking into it? This is an image of Richard Register's. It's on the cover of his book from 2006, Eco-Cities, Rebuilding Cities in Balance with Nature. His expectation is that San Francisco will evolve over time into the 22nd century to be something like this. This is seeing the city as a regenerative commons. It's seeing the earth, our cities, as dynamic, living, shared systems. So in our great transition, what should we expect of our cities? And the question I want to leave with you in Halifax is, what is the legacy that Halifax wants to leave for the 22nd century and beyond? And what are the decisions to make today in order to get there? Thank you.
I know that kind of looks like me, but I'm not Joe Minicozzi, in case you were confused. He's a good-looking guy. Okay. Well, good morning. My name is Paul Mackinnon. I'm the Executive Director of the Downtown Halifax Business Commission. It's my pleasure to introduce the final speaker for the first session this morning, who's also this year's Carmichael Lecturer. As many of you probably know, my predecessor was an amazing urban leader named Kate Carmichael. She passed away in 2001, and the board of the Downtown Halifax Business Commission at that time created an annual lecture series, the Carmichael Lecture, to honor her memory and to continue to inspire people in this community. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you today's Carmichael Lecturer as part of the Art of City Building Conference, Joe Minicozzi. So Joe is coming here from Asheville. He's an urban planner, and he imagines new ways to think about and visualize land use, urban design, and economics. And I had the pleasure of hearing Joe speak a number of years ago at an International Downtown Association conference. And I was struck at how succinctly and how powerfully and how humorously Joe was able to sum up the role that downtowns and main streets play in the economic development of their cities, especially given the city's dependence upon property tax. And I imagined sticking Joe in front of our municipal council, and in fact, probably in front of every municipal council across North America, because his message is that important. And it's kind of basic math in some ways, but it's something that shockingly a lot of our municipal leaders don't really understand. Joe holds a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Miami and a Master of Architecture and Urban Design from Harvard University. In 2017, he was recognized as one of the 100 most influential urbanists of all time. And I got to reconnect with Joe just last week at another IDA conference in San Antonio, and loved hearing him speak, and I'm certainly thrilled that he's here today. I'm hoping he's here today. He was in the front row. He's here. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Joe Minicozzi. Come on up, Joe.
I'm a little shorter than Paul. Well, thanks for having me here. It's been interesting doing research. I actually have to confess, I have a bit of a crush on what you all do here in Halifax. I used to be a downtown director back in Asheville a number of years ago, and I don't know if you all know the commercials that you all did for downtown, the dating game, where you showed these folks. And I thought y'all have such an interesting, humorous approach to your city that actually must be baked into your water or something, because another famous Haligonian is this guy. Do you all know Murray Langston, the unknown comic? Perhaps you should have a statue of him doing this. He lives over in Dartmouth. He's actually retired now. I don't know if he still has the bags, but anyway. I'm from Asheville, North Carolina. I don't know if y'all know where Asheville is. It's up in the mountains of the eastern seaboard, just a couple hours from Atlanta. In the Appalachians, Blue Ridge Parkway area. We have bluegrass music. We're 90,000 people. We have 44 breweries. That's 5,000 people per brewery if you're doing the math on that. And like any quirky little mountain town, we have men dressed as nuns on tall bikes that eat fire. It's your typical little place. Asheville didn't start this way. These are shots of Asheville from the 1990s. That's a 1996 Chevy Celebrity right there. That's not too long ago. That's within my generation. You could blow a cannon off and not hit anybody on Main Street. And we essentially boarded our city up and just left it to rot. We weren't urban people. Anytime somebody tried to talk about the urban environment, we would hear back from the community, that's not who we are. We're rural mountain people. We're not Charleston. We're not New Orleans. Do y'all get that in your community? Like, we're not Toronto. We're not urban, right? Well, what is urbanism? I used to work with this company, Public Interest Projects, which is a for-profit real estate development company that was started by the gentleman in the upper left. Public Interest Projects is essentially puts 75% of their money into sticks and bricks, fixing buildings, and 25% into finding entrepreneurs in seeding businesses. So we started the first vegetarian restaurant that banks said would never work. Asheville is now one of the top 10 vegetarian cities in the country. We own a nightclub that's one of the top 5 nightclubs in the entire country. We essentially take buildings like this and rehab them. It's a very simple development act, right? But the system is set up to actually discourage that. The system is set up to make that more difficult for people. This is a project, I wanted to put this out there just for food for thought. We did a joint venture public-private parking garage opportunity here. This was land that we owned that was essentially a surface parking lot in the middle of downtown. And there was a hot dog king there, which is kind of interesting. But it was just a big surface parking lot. So we're essentially rewarded to sit on this property because we pay very low taxes on this. This is the development idea, so a hotel, some housing, and then a public deck here. This is a cartoon of the legal agreement, because the first thing that happens when the attorneys get involved, you get this 55-page legal document that no one wants to read. So we made a really simple graphic to say that the public owns this and we'll have housing and hotel all around it. We're essentially baking taxes on top of a public investment, right? How do we earn money for our community while we're doing a project? It was interesting, the city actually tried to get us to buy spaces on the deck for our residents, and we're like, why? If we pay for those spaces, we're gonna put up a big reserve sign and nobody else could use them. And then we're gonna take the cost of that parking and put it into the cost of the unit. We'd rather our people be afforded the opportunity to not have a car. And then when they leave, if they have a parking pass, they can go wherever, go hiking, but you all could sell the space again. You'll make more money. The community will get more wealth, right? This is how we were treated in the newspaper. As actually in our independent magazine that we helped fund, we were treated like this big boss hog kind of developer. It was kind of fun. Communities have a hard time understanding the role of the developer in the society, and you just have to take it. So this project, this is the taxes paid here before it was built. Here it is now. It's not even done. There will be a third building sitting on top of this soon. Or I'm a graphic guy, let me make a graphic for you. This is a 2,900% growth in your revenue, or this is $11,000 compared to $300,000. You know, come on, Joe, this is a community investment. I could put my money in other forms of investment. So if you kept $1 in downtown Asheville, it grew twofold. Our downtown grew twofold over 10 years, which is impressive growth for an urban environment. This is if you put your money in the S&P 500 or NASDAQ. Well, what if you put your money into this public asset? This is the growth of taxes. Oh, here, it's up here. This is the growth in your taxes that we grew our community wealth. This isn't for us, this is for all of us, right? This is our tax dollars. Go out and buy 3,000% more garbage cans, I don't care. You know, how do we do more wealth for our community? And what we found is that people are painfully illiterate on how their cities actually operate. They don't look at the data of what's sitting right there hiding in plain sight. And really stepping back, we've lost an understanding what we're really in together with. This is from Oxford Dictionary, the word incorporate, and look what it says: to constitute a company, a city, or other organization is a legal corporation, right? So if we're a $15 million developer, what's your community? Now, it's not just in the states, not just our cities, it's our states, it's our country. Joe Biden said this on the Stephen Colbert Show. The United States is the largest corporation in the world, and I'm such a nerd, I went and looked it up. This is the US code that lists us as a federal corporation. It's not to say that we're a capitalistic corporation, we are a social corporation. It's got to function financially. And it's really no different here in Canada, I suspect in England as well, because we essentially all came from the same mother. We came across the lake, or the pond with this. So my city, as a development entity, is worth $13 billion. My city of 90,000 people is worth $13 billion. It's 6 times the value of Ted Turner. Does Ted Turner wake up every day and just look at Facebook and that's how he's going to make his decisions? Of course not. So why do we let our city do the same thing, do that? Why aren't we having a conversant understanding of what our cities are? So my city is essentially a finite boundary of land that has to be managed. It's just a series of acres, right? A farmer grows on soil crops per acre, per hectare, but you're looking at an economic model of how it all operates. Let's go back to the economics of these crops. So this is one of the buildings that we rehabbed. Here it is here. The city did a streetscape project. So thank you, city, for the subsidy. You gave us a garbage can, a bike rack, 2 benches, and a street tree. Thank you, city. That's awesome. We didn't pay for it, right? It's a subsidy at our front door. That's true. We put in retail, office, and residential. The tax value went from $300,000 to $11 million. That represents a 3,500% increase in your taxes. That's what you get, right? And people say to me, well, Joe, there's a Walmart. The Walmart's $20 million. That's double the value. And it's like, well, it's really not an apples-to-apples comparison because it's 34 acres to make a Walmart happen. This is on 0.2. So this is the $20 million Walmart. Here's our building. This is my house. Those are my dogs. My dogs think they're lions. We do that to freak our neighbors out, by the way. It's real fun. But we're on 1/10 of an acre. We pay $2,000 in taxes. So if you had a 1-acre cookie cutter that fell into my neighborhood and grabbed our taxes, this is what we produce per acre in my neighborhood. That's my neighborhood's productivity, right? Y'all follow me? That's our crop yield. If you take that 1-acre cookie cutter, fly it in space and drive it on the Walmart, and divide its tax bill by the 34 acres of my corporation is consumed, this is its tax yield per acre. If you had an acre of our building, this is what you get. I was presenting this in Colorado. I was like, let me make it really easy for you people in Colorado. Actually, this works in Canada now. If you had an acre to grow something, what are you going to grow? Cash crop, right? And people are like, well, Joe, we don't do it just for property taxes. We want the retail taxes. We take the losses in the Walmart for the gains in retail, which is kind of silly, but let's go ahead and run the numbers on the retail taxes. So here's property tax difference. Here's the retail tax difference. Who would have thought that we're selling 2 times the retail sales than that? We got a lot more residents than them, and we also have more jobs. So what I've found is that we haven't been conversant in making an apples-to-apples understanding of what's really going on, nor are we literate about how our tax system basically rewards the opposite. Now, what's funny about this is some people say to me, they're like, dude, what's your problem? Why do you hate Walmart? And I'm like, you're totally missing the point. So I presented at the International Association of Assessing Officers conference. Anybody hang out with a bunch of assessors? Can imagine 3,000 of them. It makes a planning conference feel like Burning Man by comparison. It's the squarest conference. But this guy was presenting at 8 in the morning, and he was presenting spreadsheet after spreadsheet on how cheap his buildings are. I'm in the back of the room drinking my coffee going, this is awesome. This guy's getting all of his property taxes lowered in one meeting. That's efficient. Now, the urbanist inside me was having a coronary because I'm like, how is he getting away with this? Why doesn't anybody care? Well, the assessors are agnostic. If you build low value, they can't make value out of it. It is what it is. So let me make it real simple for you. When you base your property tax system on property value, there's a perverse incentive for me as a developer to build junk in your community, period. Sorry to the architects in the room. We want to see more valuable buildings, but our tax system doesn't reward that. Just understand that. Don't hate the player, hate the game. Understand the tax system. Or a Walmart lasts as long as a cat. Sorry to the cat people in the room. But it's a 15-year building. That's what our tax system rewards. So I just want you to realize this isn't complex math that I'm doing here. It's 5th grade division. It's understanding productivity units. And when we do this, we talk about cars. We don't talk about cars on a miles per tank basis, do we? If we did, we'd all be driving Ford F-150s at 650 miles per tank. I didn't convert this to kilometers, sorry. But instead we say miles per gallon. The numbers change, and we should all be driving BMW Asettas at 70 miles per gallon. Understand the numbers, understand productivity. Land is all that you have to control and understand where you're wasting it. So we've done this all across Canada, or the United States, Canada, up in Guelph, New Zealand, Australia. When you stack the numbers up, when you push all of our data together, this is the average regional tax. Somebody out in the States, we call them counties. Here you call them regions. This is what they pay out there versus the city resident to the same jurisdiction. This is the Walmart, the mall. This is a 2-story building, 3-story building, 6-story building. I'm not talking skyscrapers here, folks. I'm just talking about when you stack stories, you're stacking your wealth. And this could be in Driggs, Idaho, Durham, or Dallas. As soon as you start stacking these stories, you're stacking your community wealth. That urban environment is what created our wealth, and we've essentially destroyed it over 50 years. So this is just simple math. This isn't difficult to understand. Don't make it complex. Make it simple. It actually goes back to Ian McHarg. I've been raving about Ian McHarg this whole time. He even said it's all about an economic model. It's understanding the economics of your cities. So let's take Ian's world of using GIS layers to kind of map out those different economic layers of your community. And I can map your brain. I can also map your economics and give you an economic MRI. So this is back to Asheville. This is my county, 350 square miles, non-taxable in gray, green is low value, purple is high value. This is the Biltmore Estate. That's America's largest house. It's worth $100 million, one house. But it's not fair because it's a 180,000 square foot house on 2,000 acres of land. It's the biggest gas tank, right? So rather than total value, let's go value per acre. The map just changed. I'll show it to you in 3D. Anybody want to guess where downtown Asheville is? Boom, right there. And we could even see our little sister, Black Mountain. We can see its main street popping up much like this one. This is 10 miles away. We can see the physical effect of the finances of our city in a model. Let's build our wealth. We find weird things. This is one of my favorites, West Palm Beach, Florida. You can guess where the ocean is. We wiped out the ocean value. This is the human value of what we create in the man-made city. So you find things like this. This building at $10.5 million an acre is actually more productive than the skyscraper 2 blocks away at $9.2 million. So don't just assume that if I'm talking value and money, I'm talking big stuff. You can find your wealth in little stuff. This was kind of fun. I don't know if y'all are Trump supporters, but we grabbed all the Donald's property. The Donald's pull in $400,000 of value per acre, which is actually less productive than one of the poorest neighborhoods at $600,000. When I showed this to the city council, one of the councilors said to me, he goes, "Well, that's not right." And I said, "Correct." So, again, don't hate the player, hate the game. Understand what kind of game is going on and be literate about it. So retail taxes, this is Austin. You can guess where downtown Austin is. This is the property taxes. This is the amount of drinking they do in downtown Austin. They drink a lot. I think Halifax might look this way too, but here's the retail model. This is the mall zone in here. So you can see how much more productive the downtown is over the mall. And at a local level, let's go to Durango because it's an isolated, independent city. There's not a lot of other cities connected to it. But this is the property tax model of Durango. This is the mall, Home Depot, Walmart's all over here. This is the retail model. This is the total productivity. This is jobs. But I had a couple of folks, Tim and Peter. He has a coffee shop, and for some reason he sells a bunch of kitchen stuff. Peter owns a bookstore, and he loves honey. But anyway, they opened their books for us. This is their acres consumed. This is their property tax paid. These two independent businesses on Main Street are paying, 15 times the property taxes? Retail taxes, 5 times the retail taxes of a Walmart. Jobs. Now let me ask you the next level of economic questions. On which side of this ledger, the blue side or the gray side, who's hiring the local attorney, the local accountant, the local ad executive? This side, right? Now let's ask the social side. Who's volunteering for the planning board, the community cook-off, or a blood drive? Is it this side or this side? If we aren't literate in our tax policies to see that we're actually essentially selling our own corporations and communities out, we don't see that they're also tearing apart our social structure and other economic opportunities. We have to understand this stuff. So if we're not measuring it, you can't manage it. This is just another little fun one. This is, anybody want to guess what this is? This is Redlands, California. We asked the community, we're like, what's that spike there? And they said, oh, it's got to be this thing. That's the tallest building downtown. It was actually this. This is 20 million an acre. This is 6 million. And you find things like this little shoe repair shop. Could you imagine trying to propose this in Halifax? Like, what horse would you run me out of town on trying to propose that? It's probably illegal. But 3 acres of that would equal the 13-acre Walmart. There was a time we allowed the entrepreneurial activity to grow our communities up, and we've kind of forgotten that. We've lost that ability. But just for fun, they have this mall downtown that they tore apart of downtown down, and the mall's now kind of dying. So we went back into the Sanborn maps and pulled their history of what they used to have there. So here's the mall. This is what's left of downtown. So that's called foreshadowing right there, because this is what they threw away. So they essentially threw away $15 million of wealth in doing that development. As you look around your city, you will see these bombs that we dropped on ourselves for 50 years. We never ran this kind of economic analysis. We didn't think forward what we were doing. We were just modernizing. It's a new reality, right? And we weren't conscious of what we were doing to ourselves. So if you want to make America great again, we have a plan. Just go backward. Anyway, you're probably wondering about Canada. It's a lot of fun coming up here. And we did a project in Guelph. And I love pulling postcards of places. I'm like, what do you guys care about? Like little girls with Bambi and like highways? Like, anyway, this is Guelph. And, you know, you can see the same American damage on the north side of Guelph, where they've essentially undervalued their development. Their downtown is clearly killing it. And this is the attitude of looking at your city through a different lens to see what kind of value you want to recreate. So they're talking about adding more purple stuff, right? It's real simple. We were in Auckland, and this is their sexy model here. And you can see their transit corridors coming out, which is really kind of cool. But I showed them a highway project we were doing in Asheville. And so this is this massive, count your blessings here, this a 500-acre parcel of land that they're just talking about a highway, and they're not even thinking about the city. This is our downtown right here. So we started a citizens activist team to redesign the highway, and we took all of their spaghetti and kind of condensed it down to this. It's been going on since 2003. Our state is still fighting us over this. But basically what we're looking at is capturing our community back that's currently all right-of-way right here. So you can see what we do with public housing in the South. This is not fair. But how do you stitch this neighborhood back together? So go from this to this, this to this. So as we're drawing these images, we're also running the numbers on this. What kind of value does it create for the city? And just for the heck of it, we threw new civic space in, but this is all currently non-taxable. So to not do this development means that we're throwing away $111 million of tax opportunity for our community. So this pretty picture is worth $111 million to my community in city, county, and school taxes, right? So this is trying to get folks to understand this. As we were presenting this to New Zealand, this is what's kind of wild about people in New Zealand. They said, could we do this? We've got this, here's their city, you can see their density, and the corresponding tax values that come with it. They had these divots, this hole right here and this hole right there. And they're like, what is that? We're like, well, it's a lake and then a highway. So you might want to look at that highway. Can't change the lake. So anyway, they did this project where they looked at tearing down the overpass and the freeway infrastructure and essentially harvesting those taxes. This was 2 months after I showed them that last drawing, and we looked at the whole, and if you do nothing, they're like Toronto. If you do nothing, you're still going to see a rise in value. But if you do this intervention, you can actually harvest different tax rates, right? So this is if you do nothing, this is if you do the intervention, and here's the difference. So they've essentially seen that they can get $80 million of new rates or new taxes. And 2 months after this was done, they said, okay, we're moving on to another one. We've already decided we're going to do this. This is how fast they're reacting, and in Asheville, we're working on this for 20 years. Minneapolis, we did the same thing. Anybody want to guess where downtown Minneapolis is? Here's their retail. This is their downtown. This is Mall of America. That's the biggest mall in North America, and you can see how little retail taxes it produces next to downtown. So we did this just as for fun. This is this highway. We kind of covered it up. Basically, this is rush hour traffic in 9 o'clock. And so this is what they threw away. $655 million of their community they threw away. And that was then, in the 60s, when they did this. If you take today's thinking, they have these good infill buildings along the greenway that they're doing. If you had that in here, that would be about $1.8 billion worth of development. All of Minneapolis is worth $42 billion. Let that wash over you for a second. This is what, 1/16 the entire value of the entire city? Or if you do this transit stuff by the university, which is like right there, if you put that there, this will add a value of $7 billion. A $42 billion city could have $7 billion if they just act on a project. Why not? Is this all too nerdy? You guys good with this? One last example. Actually, let me kind of skip ahead. We talked about the 7 generations. This is Lancaster, California, outside of Los Angeles, up and over the mountain. They have 953 miles of roads in their city, which will basically span from Los Angeles to Portland. So we put it on a timeline. Their great-grandparents went on a little road building spree. They went to sleep for a while. We stopped them right here. But their grandparents woke up and did this after World War II. Well, guess what? That's the first generation. That comes back to haunt you in a second generation here. So you have to rebuild all of those roads. Roads don't magically fix themselves. So that, when your parents were faced with that capital improvement bill, they go out and let out more development, more roads. So this comes back to haunt you in a second life cycle. It brings along with it this. So we just did a build-rebuild cycle of all of their infrastructure, and this is what it looks like. Do you all see a problem? That first wave isn't so bad. Well, it's kind of painful. It's painful again, but it gets more and more painful as time goes on. As you look around your city, realize how much stuff you've accrued and that it needs to be fixed and replaced. So if you don't have money for the greenway, the art teacher, or the dancing traffic cop, it's not that you don't have the money, it's that you've buried it places. Final thing is the ROI. We did a project, these are your cousins in Lafayette, Louisiana. Y'all kicked them out of here and they moved down there. And the mayor told us they were broke. They're Cajuns, they're very funny people. There must be a humor thing connection, but we did this project with Chuck Marone. He's coming here. Y'all are having him here, next week or something? Go to his presentation, he's awesome. But they told us they were broke. We looked at their budgets. I'm seriously not making this up. This is the cover of their budget document from 20 years ago. This is their government about to get hit by a wave and eaten by a shark. And what do you think the politicians did when faced with this information? You don't even have to read the document. They just kicked the can down the road. To her credit, the finance officer was like, hey, did I mention how screwed we are? And then the third year, they finally acted. And they basically consolidated their city and their region together, like a agglomeration that you all had, taking down even more infrastructure. They were already going broke. This just kind of accelerated it. So this is all their city. This is downtown. This is some new urbanism here. That's the revenue. Roads cost money. When we were showing this to one of the counselors, he said this to us. It's not where you live, it's what you believe. What does that even mean? The public works director responded to this statement by saying this: there's no such thing as an infrastructure fairy. Which is hilarious. So we photoshopped Kevin in on that one. And so Kevin's like, run the numbers. Well, here's the problem. This is the debt load of all the roads that they've built. This is their actual revenue. If you're already feeling pain, it's not going to get better over time. So let me make it easier for you. Do you have enough blue to pay for your red? Your liability is 18 times your revenue. And you've already gone out to the bond market. They're skimming off the top of all of your money. You're going broke. This is the reason why. You own too much stuff. So this is a whole city floating in the harbor. This is the bill that we sent everybody to their parcel. This is their revenue. So we're going to net your revenue against your expenses. What's in the black, what's in the red. Here's the whole county region in 3D. And you can see how it's bleeding all over the place. If you just drop this on the floor so everything pops up vertically, this is what it looks like. If you're colorblind, this is probably easier for you. But this is, they told me, they're like, Joe, look, people really want to live out here. I'm like, yeah, that's what you're paying people to move out there. That's a subsidy. Account for it. And so, just make it simple, they had 34,000 people in 1950, 5 feet of pipe per person, 2.4 fire hydrants per thousand. They grew their population to 121,000. This is their feet of pipe per person today. Their fire hydrants per thousand today. A 350% growth in population, 1,000 and 2,000% growth in liability. Did y'all measure your pipes? Do you know how much you got? And they told us, they're like, Joe, no, but we got rich. We got oil money out of the Gulf. I'm like, all right, we'll measure that. Here's your household income adjusted for today's dollars then, and here it is today. You've gotten rich, but it's only 160% growth in wealth. That doesn't compensate for 1,000 and 2,000% growth in liability. So if we're not measuring this stuff and showing this stuff, we're essentially kicking the can down the road. We're going to have to deal with this. How am I doing on time? Am I up? Okay. One last example. Our country was formed on a tax revolt, and yet we don't even look at this stuff. So I'll use an American example that you all can relate to. This is Charleston. Charleston's an old place. We removed the value of the ocean on them. This is the human effect. But they have old buildings that were built before the United States, right? We have a birth date. So buildings like this is built in 1686. This is the oldest liquor store in the United States. That's a revolutionary getting his drink on. But here are all the old buildings, the colonial states buildings, right? There they are in plan, 21 acres of those buildings, and this is what they paid in county taxes. For you, it would be a regional tax, right? This is what the region got. $600,000 They pay a city tax and a bid tax on top of that. But this is what the region got. Out in the region, there's a Walmart, 21 acres. This is what it paid the same year. Now remember, this is going to be gone in 15 years. It'll be gone by 2020. If we're not looking at how we're building wealth, we won't have that wealth for those needs that we have, for affordable housing, for other purposes. We're essentially driving ourselves broke. And these aren't invisible market forces. This is tax policy that are driving these decisions and how we finance things. And you can hurt yourself with it. So just to close, looking around, you know, we've seen this before. This is in Normandy, you were taxed on your building footprint, and people started projecting out over the street to avoid taxes. In England, you were taxed on your number of windows you had, and people started boarding up windows to avoid taxes. France, you were taxed below your roof line, so people stuck stories up here. When the tax assessor came out, they said, this is clearly the roof, right? This is all how our cities are shaped. And as designers, we need to be in tune to that, to understand the policies that are essentially inherently driving us broke. So we call this a form of geo-accounting. Your accountant doesn't care if you buy a boat, right? Your accountant cares if you can afford a boat. Just put the numbers out there, have an agnostic discussion about it, put them on a map. You know, it's like, can you show people what's going on and do your math? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Joe, so much. That was amazing. So what we're going to do is we are cutting in a bit into our lunch break, but we do want to have still commit to the panel. So we will ask our speakers to come back up, and then TJ will moderate. So we'll have about a panel for about kind of 10, 15 minutes. But if you do have to run out and grab lunch, feel free to do so. We're just going to continue on. Okay, thanks.
Something about the audio there.
Yeah.
All right, how was that? Thank you, everybody, for coming, and just looking forward to the discussion. We'll keep it quick. We've got some time. So I just want to start off by thanking you all for coming to Halifax and being part of this day. So, Indy, you said a profound line that I wrote down. We need to unleash the value of everyone around us. And Angela Davis was here last week or a week and a half ago, and she was asked the question, what would it take to create a world where we all feel like we truly belong? So considering that this conference is our place in the city, how do we have better conversations around the value in ourselves, and so that everybody can feel like they belong?
I mean, to be honest, I think it starts at multiple levels. One of the things that I think that is broken is that we see welfare as a cost. So we see welfare institutions as a cost and an overhead, and it's something that we have to think about that perspective. But if you see welfare as an investment, if we see it as a mechanism to invest, to unlock the full value of your citizens, have a completely different relationship with that conversation. And in discourse terms, it's turned into, we perceive all of that infrastructure as cost. And it's not, a school is not a cost, it's an investment to unlock capacity. So it's actually, as Joe was saying, it's how we account for the world around us. You know, every CEO here, many of you are, will turn around and say, people are my biggest assets. Yeah, but you look at your balance sheet, where are people? They're on the overhead side of the conversation. So it's also structured into how we put together, how we see the world is structured in our balance sheets. And I think there's a fundamental question in how we see and unlock value, and unlock the value of people. As Joe rightly said, it's not just about taxation, it's also about social costs. Look at the cost of going to prison, look at the cost of actually crime. These are social costs, and these are costs that are perpetual. They go long into our future. How do we bring them in? How do we allow for capital investment to mitigate those? And that builds completely different cities. Cities aren't necessarily about enhancing footprints or number of square feet per acre. It's actually about also enhancing social value in a combined sense. And that requires us to imagine cities in a fundamentally different way and build them differently, design them differently.
And then for the second, does anybody have any points they would no?
Well, I just want to pick up on that because, you know, when I do my presentation, I frequently get criticized for only looking at money. And what I'm actually trying to do is show the discussion that's actually happening that's not at the table. That we've essentially drained and beat up our urban environments to spread that wealth, and it really is a social investment in a suburbia. It's a subsidy that's out there. And a lot of people aren't aware that they're enjoying a subsidy, but they'll criticize somebody else getting it. But if you can make it visual for people so they can see it, so we can actually put it on the table and talk about it, that's the key, is how do you make a common language and we can all see the information together. And that's the reason why we're proponents of those models.
I'm going to pass, for the second question, I'm going to pass it to Sophia.
So I was just thinking, if we all got to sit down right now and actually harness the energy in the room and have some discussions, what question would you ask us to help challenge us and think in this broader global context that you've been helping us imagine today?
Well, for me, it would be about the expectations, the ambition for Halifax. So Halifax obviously has extraordinary resources as it is, extraordinary human resources, physical resources, all kinds of university resources, and so on, landscape resources, the list goes on. But how do you see yourselves not just what the assets that you have are, but what about the global context? And what is Halifax's place in Canada and in the world going forward, and in the much distant future? So I think really looking far ahead with very high expectations is what I would be asking.
So the interesting thing is that our whole concept of this conference was sort of our place in the city, but there's this whole discussion about our place as a city in the world. It's also coming up through this, which is pretty cool. All right, so we'd like to open it up to the audience, considering we don't have much time. So does anybody have a question? Hands up. Erica. There's a mic coming for you.
Both Indy and Joe referred to this problem we have with accounting, right? We're not keeping track of things well enough to inform our own decisions. So is there any practical, even small level examples that you've seen of people that are doing different in towns, cities, anything? I mean, what should we be looking at?
I mean, we did a project in Peoria, Illinois, which isn't exactly the intellectual epicenter of the United States. And we just, as a simple exercise, measured the amount of land that they dedicated to surface parking versus the amount of land they dedicated to buildings. Buildings are on 8.6 square miles for the entire metro. 8.6 square miles, that's buildings. Parking lots are 9 square miles. When you look at the cash flow on that, the taxes that come off it, you're getting $1 billion a square mile off buildings and only $40 million off your parking. And so we can show them graphically they've essentially committed to a landscape that's not paying its share back into the roads. And by the way, they have 12.5 square miles of roads, which is, it will build a road from Peoria, which is in the middle of the country, to Vancouver. That's the amount of liability that they have to pay for. So I would ask you all, if you could do one simple thing, is map your wasted space. Map your spaces that aren't places. You know, we're walking out of the hotel in this kind of dead zone of surface parking lots, then running across the street real fast and not get hit by a car. Those kinds of places are an opportunity lost to challenge for your community. You're essentially paying for it, whether you like it or not. But what places can you engender new spaces and new places for people to come together and actually build community wealth and social well-being there? It's all by design. You're either designing it or it's happening without it.
Yeah, I would literally just build on that layer and say, look at your social infrastructure costs. So we know, for example, like you're saying about kind of stats about going to prison in the US, $1 million blocks, there have been others. So let's put your social costs in. Let's put in the kind of, in a way, the opportunity costs of actually your kids not being well educated, what the losses, what the potential future losses are in terms of tax revenue. So when you start to frame all this stuff on your spatial visual accounting, you make different decisions. Because you don't just see it as a cost, it's a little sunk cost in my school. You say, well, actually, if I improve that school, this is what the implications are further downstream to future tax revenue. And that builds a completely different conversation around not just physical infrastructure, which I think, to be honest, one of the best maps I've seen in mapping of that and analysis I've seen on that from Joe, is how do we now layer that with social infrastructure costs. You put the two together, I think we make different decisions about our city, and it reframes the conversation. I think that would be a really powerful thing. That's where I give Jayne and Colin Foundation Social Finance Committee work really a bit of a play, because that's actually what it's about. Social impact bonds are a poem of a different future, where future social costs are pulled together and allow for capital investment again. So they are a poem, they're not just an answer, they're a short poem. And I think that's where social finance work that McConnell's been doing on is really critical in building that second part of the layer that I think Joe's been putting together.
So this is an amazing alchemy and combination between all these, and this question I think really helps get at the heart of this. So Joe's presentation is both the most depressing and most hopeful presentation in many ways. And the accounting for it financially makes it very clear. But obviously, there's these other dimensions too that compound this, both how depressing and what a challenging crisis we're in, but the potential of it. And so the value creation of place is so powerful, and that has to be captured as well. But place capital is a way to essentially account for more holistically these other types of values that are both degraded by the types of land use Joe's talking about and built upon. And in Adelaide, a similar sized city, they developed place capital metrics to evaluate the success of government, actually, of the city government there, to more holistically look at these things. And it's really important that we move beyond sustainability and even resilience to looking at how do we create really a thriving world and place this sort of the compete to contribute to shared value, this common value of place is a way to create a world that creates new stories, a new poetry essentially, sort of an alchemy of intricate minglings, all these fun phrases. But it's also a storied culture. So I think in a way the metrics alone aren't going to get us there. They're going to create the case for it. But the great transformations of cities are much more storied. And as I said, the great places weren't necessarily, they might have been informed by cost-benefit analysis, but that can also suck the life out of these things and lead perpetuates a project-driven, siloed approach to city building. So it's the transformation, it's the stories, and it's stories through which we feel belonging to, how we connect our story to a place and become part of that story, feel like we're co-creating that place, contributing to it, competing to contribute. That's when it becomes powerful. So how you all are part of the story, how it connects to your indigenous stories here, your stories of place from around the world, but then how you collectively create a whole new story that is much bigger than some of all of these parts.
This building used to be a parking lot.
Used to be. That's a great story.
Yeah. We'll open it up for one more question. Sure. Someone else had their hand up. So.
Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. You can keep it quick. I can get one. Yeah. Thank you, Joe. You have communicated marvelously some really essential facts.
how do we clone you? How do we get more people in this industry who can communicate so effectively, graphically, non-numerically? I mean, I know the base is numbers, but the visuals tell the story.
I can talk to my mom, but I don't think she I just try to make pictures, you know. I'm not trained in finance or, I'm trying to make it simple. There's a great quote from Charles Mingus, making the simple complicated is commonplace. Making the complicated simple, that takes creativity. And so it's a challenge that we have in our company is that when we take complex objects, how do we break them down and make them simple so people can see it? And that's our challenge.
Thank you. We have one more question from the back.
Thank you. So, yeah, we know there are constantly leaving people behind, and thank you for speaking to that. But when we continually ask how to make our processes more equitable, we often hear we need to invite people to the conversation. And yet, for me, this is unsatisfactory because it points to this power dynamic that seems to be perpetuated constantly. And so my question is, how do we move away from equity as an afterthought towards a system that puts common good at the center? And how do we ensure that there are accountability mechanisms in place to check the power in one's family? I hope that's not too long.
So I would say one response to that for me is about changing the infrastructure and expectations of everyday life. So yes, a culture of invitation into engagement processes is important, and that's kind of our framing, that's how we think about it. But I think what we need to move to much more is a culture of agency, where it's not about people just being invited in, where people actually have a sense of agency to be in. They don't need the invitation, that's actually what they expect. That's what freedom, that's what sovereignty is. And so it's one of the reasons that I gave participatory city as an example of that, because it kind of enshrines that in its approach and in its methodology, but it's certainly not limited to that one particular initiative. It's more of a posture, of a way of thinking about our everyday life. I would also add one more example, and that is, in fact, it's something that we're working on a little bit in Montreal, with the idea of creating civic innovation mechanisms like civic innovation labs, which are hybrid and which include city government, but also are involving other sectors as well as citizens. And so for example, creating citizen assemblies through citizen assemblies and juries that make decisions about prototyping of experimentation on the ground and so on. So involving much more, even in how technology is evolving, how we involve citizens in taking decisions about values and how they're created, and about how we position ourselves for the future as it's rapidly changing, I think is such an important question. So changing culture around that.
I just want to add to that. From a standpoint of equity and inclusion, one of the things that I grew up in upstate New York, up in the Adirondack Mountains. My whole entire family are Trump voters. When I would come back from university and talk about city planning, I would get these blank stares from my family, and they just wouldn't get it. And I found that it was my language that was a barrier for them understanding. And for me to just ignore that shows that I have a lack of empathy and understanding for them. What they are is they're not engaged in an understanding of the conversation. So what you just saw in my presentation it's a very rigorously created story to give images and bring the conversation down to a 6th grade learning. This isn't to call them ignorant. This is just how do I make information accessible for the audience to quickly understand the information. And if we use language as a barrier, words that we feel good about, but they may not play on the other side of the aisle, we're essentially eliminating our ability to engage and be equitable in that conversation. And for the states in particular, this is critical for us because we're in a post-fact society. So I have to deliver facts to people in a way that they can absorb them quickly and not let their biases and heuristics get in the way based on the language that I use. And that would be my challenge to all the students in the room that are going through their planning education, is to learn that, because this is something we all have to understand, is that we can become our own barriers to how we deliver information.
You can stop this question.
You can cut anyone off. So amazing commentary this morning and great questions. We keep this on such a tight schedule because we have brought in a whole range of amazing presenters. We have the library for one day until 4 o'clock, and that's sort of why it's a bit militaristic in how we keep the schedule. But if you do have additional questions, please feel free to DM us on Twitter, and we'll look to get those answered. We will have future panels, but we thank you for all our presenters this morning. That was highly engaging and really thought-provoking, so thank you. We will take a 10-minute break for lunch, and so that's how we roll. So we'll be back here at 12:15, but it's very fluid, so obviously come and go as you need to. But our next presentation will start at 12:15. Thank you.